Good evening and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a world that believed itself protected by faith, law, and empire could be quietly undone by something so small it could not be seen, yet so powerful it reshaped centuries of history? Tonight we step into a time when the Mediterranean world felt stable, ordered, and confident in its endurance right before that confidence dissolved. This is not a story of sudden collapse, but of slow realization of people continuing daily life while an invisible force moved closer with each passing day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I invite you to share where you are listening from and what time it is. There right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early 6th century, the Mediterranean world was bound together by roads, ports, ships, laws, and habits that had developed over many generations. People traveled more than we sometimes imagine, and goods moved constantly across land and sea. Grain from Egypt fed cities far away. Silk and spices passed through many hands before reaching imperial markets. Letters, orders, and ideas moved along the same routes. To those living within it, this world felt connected and dependable, held together by a long memory of Roman order. At the center of this system stood the Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople. The city itself was a place of density and rhythm. Bells marked hours of prayer. Markets opened at dawn. Ships arrived daily at crowded harbors. The population was large, diverse, and accustomed to relying on systems that usually worked. Water flowed through aqueducts. Food was distributed through state-managed channels. Law courts met regularly. Disease was known, of course, but it was familiar seasonal fevers, local outbreaks, illnesses that came and went. Nothing suggested that the basic fabric of life was fragile. This sense of continuity was reinforced by leadership. The Emperor Justinian ruled with confidence and purpose. His reign was shaped by the belief that the Roman world could be restored to its former unity. His armies were active, his laws ambitious, his building projects monumental. The empire appeared not only stable, but expanding. Many people believed they were living through a moment of renewal rather than decline. The past was a guide, not a warning. Religion also played a steadying role. Christianity shaped daily routines and explanations for hardship. Churches were full, rituals familiar. And faith provided a framework for understanding suffering. When things went wrong, people prayed, donated, fasted, and trusted that order would return. This trust did not eliminate fear, but it softened it. Life, even when difficult, felt intelligible. Yet beneath this calm surface, conditions were quietly aligning. The empire's strength depended on movement of goods. People, animals, and resources. Cities were crowded. Storage facilities were full. Harbors were busy. Rats lived alongside humans, feeding on the same abundance that supported urban life. Fleas traveled easily, unnoticed, from place to place. None of this was unusual. It was simply part of how cities functioned. Climate and environment also played subtle roles. Shifts in weather patterns affected harvests and migration routes, though few would have noticed these changes as part of a larger pattern. What mattered more was that the system continued to function. And because it did, no one saw danger in its success. In distant regions beyond the awareness of most imperial citizens, something new was stirring. Illness existed in many forms. But this one behaved differently. It moved along trade routes without respect for borders. It did not announce itself dramatically at first. A few deaths, here, a cluster there. Easy to explain away, easy to ignore. The empire had endured far worse, or so it seemed. Information traveled slowly and uniformly. News arrived through merchants, officials, and letters, often distorted or delayed. Reports of sickness in faraway places did not feel urgent. The world was large, and suffering elsewhere was a familiar fact of life. There was no reason to think that events at the edges of the empire would soon matter at its heart. Daily life continued. Children were born. Contracts were signed. Taxes were signed. Taxes were collected. Soldiers drilled. Clergy debated doctrine. The rhythm of time moved forward. measured in seasons and feast days rather than headlines. People planned for the future with confidence that tomorrow would resemble today. This is what makes the coming change so striking. The Justinian plague did not emerge into chaos or collapse. It entered a world that believed itself ordered, resilient, and protected by centuries of experience. The shock was not only the number of deaths, but the sway familiar explanations failed to keep pace with reality. In the months and years that followed, people would search for meaning in scripture, medicine, and rumor. They would struggle to maintain systems that had always seemed reliable. They would discover that the same connections that brought prosperity could also carry disaster. But at this moment, at the beginning of our story, none of that is yet clear. Justinian and his imperial vision. By the time the unseen illness was beginning its slow movement through distant regions, the Eastern Roman Empire was governed by a man who believed deeply in order, continuity, and restoration. Justinian did not see himself merely as a ruler, maintaining what already existed. He believed he was repairing history itself, carefully reassembling a world that had fractured long before his birth. This belief shaped nearly every decision of his reign, and in ways few could anticipate. It also shaped how the empire would experience disaster. Justinian came to the throne in 527, inheriting an empire that was wealthy, administratively complex, and geographically exposed. The Western Roman Empire had fallen decades earlier, but in the East, Roman institutions remained remarkably intact. Law courts functioned, taxation flowed, and imperial authority was recognized across vast territories. Justinian viewed this as survival, not as a consolation prize, but as proof that Rome's true heart still beat in the East. From Constantinople, he intended to extend that heartbeat outward again. His vision rested on three pillars: law, faith, and territory. Each was pursued with steady determination rather than theatrical ambition. Justinian did not rely on charisma or public performance. He governed through documents, decrees, councils, and sustained pressure. This approach created strength, but it also produced rigidity, a system optimized for control rather than flexibility. One of his earliest and most enduring achievements was legal reform. Roman law had accumulated for centuries, layered with contradictions, outdated rulings, and regional variations. Justinian ordered it reorganized, clarified, and standardized. The result, later known as the Corpus Juris, was not merely a compilation, but a declaration that law itself could be made orderly. Again, for administrators, judges, and scholars, this project reinforced the idea that the empire was rational and governable. Problems, no matter how complex, could be addressed through careful structure. At the same time, Justinian invested heavily in religious unity. Christianity was not new to the empire, but theological divisions were deep and persistent. Disputes over doctrine were not abstract arguments. They shaped loyalty, rebellion, and social cohesion. Justinian worked closely with church leaders to enforce orthodoxy, suppress dissent, and define correct belief. Churches were built, doctrines clarified, and heresies condemned. Faith was meant to be a unifying force, binding subjects together under both God and emperor. Territorially, Justinian pursued what later generations would call reconquest. He believed that lands once Roman could be Roman again. Military campaigns were launched in North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. These wars were costly, but often successful. Cities changed hands, old Roman names returned to maps. For many, it felt as though history was turning backward in the best possible way. These campaigns depended on logistics as much as strategy. Armies required steady supplies of food, equipment, and pay. Ships moved constantly between provinces. Grain shipments were essential not only for civilians, but for soldiers stationed far from agricultural centers. The empire's ability to project power rested on its ability to move resources smoothly across long distances. This constant movement reinforced a sense of imperial vitality. Ports were busy, storehouses were full. Officials tracked inventories with precision. To contemporary observers, this was not a fragile system. It was an efficient one refined through generations of experience. Its complexity was seen as strength, not risk. Justinian himself embodied this confidence. Contemporary descriptions portray him as tireless, methodical, and deeply engaged with governance. He reviewed documents late into the night. He listened to advisors, weighed options, and made decisions grounded in precedent. He was not impulsive. This steadiness reassured those around him. If challenges arose, the emperor would address them through established channels. Yet, this very steadiness would later become a limitation. Systems designed for stability struggle when conditions change rapidly. Justinian's empire was excellent at maintaining order under known pressures, but less prepared for forces that did not fit existing categories. The emperor's court reflected this dual nature. It was highly organized, deeply hierarchical, and intensely bureaucratic. Positions were clearly defined. Responsibilities were carefully assigned. When something went wrong, the instinct was to identify the appropriate office, issue instructions, and expect compliance. This worked well for tax collection, legal districts, and military logistics. It was less effective for an outbreak that ignored borders, offices, and decrees. Economic life under Justinian was similarly structured. The state played an active role in regulating markets, particularly in essential goods, like grain. Prices were monitored, supplies were allocated. These measures prevented shortages in normal times and reinforced public trust in imperial management. Citizens believed the state could protect them from scarcity. This belief extended to health, though not in the modern sense. Public sanitation, aqueduct maintenance, and waste management were all part of urban administration. While medical knowledge was limited, there was a sense that a clean, orderly city was a healthy one. Disease was viewed as episodic rather than systemic, something that appeared and disappeared without altering the underlying structure of life. Justinian's building projects further reinforced this impression. The reconstruction of Hagia Sophia, after riots damaged its predecessor, was not only an architectural achievement, but a statement of endurance. Stone, marble, and light combined to create a space that suggested permanence. To worship beneath its dome was all feel part of something stable and enduring. All of this mattered deeply when the plague began to spread. The empire's leadership, including Justinian himself, approached early reports of illness through familiar frameworks. Was this a local problem, a seasonal outbreak, a matter for provincial authorities? The idea that disease could undermine imperial projects on a vast scale was difficult to accept because it lay outside the categories through which power was understood. Moreover, Justinian's ongoing wars meant that attention and resources were already committed elsewhere. Armies could not simply be recalled without consequences. Taxes could not easily be reduced without affecting supply chains. Decisions had momentum. The empire was in motion, and changing course required time. The emperor's vision also shaped public expectations. People believed the state was strong because it had shown strength repeatedly. They believed law would function, food would arrive, and order would be maintained. This confidence delayed panic, but it also delayed adaptation. Early signs of crisis were absorbed into existing routines rather than prompting structural change. It is important to understand that this was not negligence. From the perspective of those involved, continuing established practices was the responsible choice. Stopping trade, halting campaigns, or altering administrative procedures carried risks that were well understood. The risks posed by disease were less clear. As the months passed, reports became harder to ignore, mortality increased, labor shortages appeared. But even then, responses were incremental. Adjustments were made within the system rather than to the system itself. Justinian's empire was designed to endure pressure by distributing it across institutions, and for a time this approach seemed to work. The emperor himself would soon experience the limit of this confidence. When illness reached Constantinople in full force, it did not respect hierarchy or preparation. Even the ruler at the center of the system would find himself vulnerable, subject to the same uncertainty as his subjects. Yet before that moment arrived, Justinian's imperial vision still stood intact. Laws were enforced, armies marched, churches filled. The empire continued to behave as though it were living through a demanding but manageable period, not the opening phase of a demographic catastrophe. This vision of restoration, order, and continuity is essential to understanding the impact of the Justinian plague. The disease did not strike a weak or disorganized society. It struck one that believed deeply in its own coherence. The shock lay not only in loss of life, but in the realization that even the most carefully maintained systems could be overwhelmed by forces they were never designed to confront. As the plague moved closer to the heart of the empire, Justinian's ambitions remained unchanged. His confidence in law, faith, and administration had been earned through years of success. It would take an unprecedented crisis to reveal the boundaries of that confidence. And that crisis was already moving silently along the same routes that carried grain, soldiers, and imperial authority. Constantinople at its height. In the years just before the plague reached the imperial capital, Constantinople stood at a moment of extraordinary confidence. To those who lived within its walls, the city did not feel like a place on the edge of catastrophe. It felt like the center of the world, carefully maintained, deeply familiar, and reassuring in its routines. Every day followed patterns that had developed over centuries, and those patterns gave the impression of permanence. Constantinople was not simply large. It was dense. Hundreds of thousands of people lived within a confined space shaped by walls, water, and topography. Houses rose several stories high, narrow streets twisted between neighborhoods, opening suddenly into markets, courtyards, or church squares. People lived close to one another, sharing walls, stairways, wells, and storage spaces. This closeness was practical, economical, and normal. It was also invisible, woven so tightly into daily life that few questioned it. The city's lifeblood was movement. Each morning began with sound, vendors setting up stalls, cartwheels on stone, footsteps echoing under colonnades, bells calling worshippers to prayer. Ships arrived steadily at the harbors, their cargoes unloaded by dock workers who knew the rhythm of tides and schedules by heart. Grain from Egypt was the most vital of these cargoes, arriving in vast quantities to feed the city's population. Its delivery was not occasional, but constant, and the system that managed it was one of the empire's greatest logistical achievements. The grain supply shaped daily expectations. Bread was not a luxury. It was a right. The state organized its distribution carefully, and people trusted that it would continue. Bakeries worked throughout the day. Long lines were common, but orderly. When bread appeared, it confirmed that the world was still functioning as it should. Markets extended this sense of abundance. Fish from nearby waters, vegetables from surrounding countryside, olive oil, wine, cloth, spices, and imported luxuries filled stalls. Merchants called out prices, buyers negotiated calmly. Even when shortages occurred, they were usually temporary and predictable. Scarcity was a known problem with known solutions. Religion structured time as much as commerce did. Churches were everywhere, from monumental basilicas to small neighborhood shrines. Feast days and fast days shaped the calendar. Services offered reassurance, familiarity, and moral clarity. Illness, when it occurred, was framed within religious understanding. People prayed for healing, made offerings, and trusted that suffering had meaning. This framework did not eliminate fear, but it placed fear within boundaries. Medical knowledge existed alongside faith. Physicians practiced in the city, drawing on ancient texts and experience. Treatments were based on balancing bodily humors, adjusting diet, applying piccases, and recommending rest. While limited by modern standards, this medicine was systematic and respected. People consulted doctors for fevers, wounds, and chronic conditions. Disease was not mysterious. It was expected, studied, and managed as best as possible. Public infrastructure reinforced the impression of control. Aqueducts delivered fresh water from distant sources. Systems stored reserves. Public baths offered cleanliness and social interaction. Waste removal, though imperfect, was organized. Streets were repaired. Walls were maintained. Guards patrolled. The city was not chaotic. It was regulated, supervised, and maintained with care. This maintenance extended to administration. Officials tracked supplies, monitored prices, recorded births and deaths, and enforced regulations. Bureaucracy was a daily presence, though most citizens encountered it only indirectly. Its existence was reassuring. Someone somewhere was responsible. Constantinople's position as a crossroads amplified its vitality. People from across the Mediterranean and beyond passed through its gates. Soldiers, pilgrims, traders, scholars, diplomats, and refugees all arrived with their own habits and expectations. Languages mixed in the streets, clothing styles varied, food reflected multiple traditions. Diversity was not remarkable. It was ordinary, This constant arrival of people and goods sustained the city's economy and culture. It also meant that the sea, Tai was never isolated. News arrived regularly, though often unevenly. Reports of events in distant provinces circulated through rumor and official channels alike. Some were taken seriously, others were dismissed as exaggerations. The city had heard many alarming stories before and survived them all. Housing reflected social hierarchy, but also shared vulnerability. Wealthier citizens lived in larger residences, with courtyards and private wells. Poorer residents occupied crowded apartments or shared spaces. Yet everyone depended on the same streets, markets, and water systems. Rats moved freely between buildings. Stored grain attracted pests, regardless of ownership. These realities were accepted parts of urban life, rarely discussed unless they caused immediate inconvenience. Seasonal illness was common enough not to cause alarm. Fevers rose in summer, respiratory illnesses appeared in winter, people adjusted routines accordingly. A few deaths in a neighborhood did not suggest crisis. Death itself was familiar, present in every generation. Cemeteries lay just beyond the walls, regularly used and maintained. The city's leadership shared this sense of familiarity. Officials addressed problems through established procedures. If illness increased, prayers might be ordered. If food distribution slowed, additional shipments would be arranged. There was confidence that solutions existed because they always had before. Even natural disasters had been absorbed into memory. Fires, earthquakes, and riots had damaged parts of the city. But each time rebuilding followed, structures rose again. Life resumed. These experiences reinforced the belief that Constantinople could endure anything. Entertainment and leisure continued. Alongside work and worship, the Hippodromium hosted races that drew enormous crowds. People gathered to cheer teams, debate outcomes, and express loyalties. These events were more than distractions. They were communal rituals that reaffirmed belonging. When crowds filled the stands, it was difficult to imagine a future in which such gatherings would feel dangerous. This confidence extended into private life. Families planned marriages, apprenticeships, and inheritances. Contracts were signed with the expectation that obligations would be fulfilled. Time felt continuous, stretching forward in predictable ways. Against this backdrop, early signs of plague were subtle. A few sailors fell ill. A cluster of deaths appeared near a harbor district. Such events were not unprecedented. Ports were always associated with illness. The city had weathered similar episodes without lasting damage. Reports reached officials, then physicians, then religious leaders. Discussions took place. Opinions differed. Some suggested environmental causes. Others saw divine testing. None immediately grasped the scale of what was approaching. Daily routines continued because stopping them seemed unnecessary and disruptive. Trade did not halt. Ships were not turned away. Grain continued to arrive. Markets stayed open. Closing the city to movement would have threatened the very systems that sustained it. This choice was not made consciously as a gamble. It was simply how things were done. The city had always functioned through openness and movement. To close itself off would have felt more dangerous than continuing as usual. As weeks passed, illness spread unevenly. Some neighborhoods were affected more than others. Death rates rose, then fell, then rose again. Patterns were unclear. People noticed, but did not yet panic. The city's scale absorbed shock, at least temporarily. When fear did appear, it was localized. A family mourned. A street grew quieter. A church filled with extra prayers, but the city as a whole remained active. Confidence persisted, not because people were ignorant, but because their experience taught them that crisis passed. This is the paradox of Constantinople at its height. Its strength delayed recognition of danger. Its systems were designed to smooth disruption, and for a time they succeeded. The very qualities that made the city resilient also made it slow to adapt. By the time the scale of the plague became undeniable, the city was already deeply entangled with it. The same ships that fed its people had carried disease. The same crowds that celebrated races had shared air and space. The same density that supported commerce had facilitated contagion. Yet in this moment, before realization fully settled in, Constantinople still felt whole. Its streets were busy. Its institutions functioned. Its people trusted in continuity. They could not yet see that the world they knew was about to change in ways that no law, ritual, or administrative order could fully contain. The city stood at the peak of its confidence, unaware that this very peak marked the beginning of a long descent into uncertainty. And it was from this height that the Justinian plague would begin its most devastating work: trade routes and silent passengers. Long before the plague reached the streets of Constantinople, it was already moving along paths so ordinary that no one thought to question them. These paths were not hidden. They were the most visible features of the Mediterranean world, roads worn smooth by centuries of use, shipping lanes traced again and again across familiar waters, caravan routes linking coast to interior. The strength of the empire rested on these routes, and so did its vulnerability. Trade in the 6th century was not occasional or accidental. It was constant, organized, and deeply embedded in daily survival. Cities depended on imported food. Armies depended on supply chains that stretched across provinces. Craftsmen relied on raw materials that came from far away. Even the poorest households were indirectly tied to long distances, exchanged through bread, oil, and clothing. Movement was not a luxury. It was necessity. Grain was the most important of all traded goods. Egypt, with its fertile Nile floodplain, had fed Roman cities for centuries. Each year, vast quantities of grain were harvested, stored, and shipped northward. The process was bureaucratic, predictable, and carefully monitored. Grain ships followed established schedules, sailing from Egyptian ports to Constantinople and other major cities. Their arrival was expected and depended upon. Delays caused concern. Interruptions caused unrest. These ships were large, sturdy, and slower moving. They carried not only grain, but people. Sailors lived aboard for weeks at a time. Dock workers handled cargo at every stop. Inspectors checked seals and documents. Rats thrived in the holds, feeding on spilled grain and nesting among sacks. Fleas lived on the rats, unseen and unremarked. None of this was unusual. It had been this way for generations. Beyond grain, the empire's trade network extended in many directions. From the east came silk, spices, and luxury goods, passing through Persia or along Red Sea routes before reaching Mediterranean ports. From the north came timber, furs, and metals. From Africa came ivory, textiles, and agricultural products. Each item passed through many hands, many buildings, many ports. Every transfer was an opportunity for unseen travelers to move as well. Overland routes played their part too. Caravans crossed deserts and mountain passes, linking coastal cities with inland markets. Inns and way stations offered rest for travelers and animals alike. Stored goods accumulated temporarily, then moved on. Rodents followed these supplies wherever they went, adapting easily to human environments. Their presence was so common that it rarely drew attention. What made these routes especially effective for the spread of disease was their regularity. Ships sailed the same paths year after year. Caravans stopped at the same places. Markets opened on predictable days. This regularity created a steady rhythm of contact between distant regions. A disease that could survive long enough within hosts or vectors did not need speed. It needed consistency. The plague bacterium, though unknown to those living at the time, benefited from this environment. It did not announce itself dramatically. It did not kill instantly or in isolation. It moved quietly, establishing itself in one place before appearing in another, often weeks or months later. This delay made it difficult to connect cause and effect. Early outbreaks occurred far from the imperial center. Reports from Egypt and surrounding regions described unusual illness and sudden deaths. These reports traveled slowly and were often incomplete. Local officials might note increased mortality, but without comparative data, it was difficult to judge severity. Epidemics were not unknown. Most faded without transforming the wider world. Trade did not stop when illness appeared. In fact, the opposite was often true. Economic pressure encouraged continued movement. If harvests were disrupted in one area, supplies were needed elsewhere. Ships sailed to meet demand. Closing ports would have threatened livelihoods and food security. The logic of trade favored continuity. Ports themselves were ideal environments for disease transmission. They were crowded, noisy, and constantly changing. People from different regions mixed briefly, then dispersed. Sanitation was uneven. Animals and goods were stored close together. Ships arriving from distant places docked side by side. In such settings, illnessy old pass from one host population to another without being noticed. Sailors were particularly vulnerable. Long voyages weakened bodies through fatigue, limited diet, and exposure. When illness appeared among crews, it was often attributed to the hardships of travel rather than something contagious. Sick sailors might be replaced at the next port, their illness carried ashore, along with cargo. The empire's administrative efficiency also played a role. Goods moved quickly through checkpoints. Delays were minimized. Officials focused on quantity and documentation rather than health. There was no concept of quarantine as a systematic practice. While isolation of the sick occurred informally, it was not integrated into trade regulation. Religious belief further shaped responses. Disease was often interpreted as divine testing or punishment. Prayer and ritual were appropriate responses, but they did not involve altering trade patterns. Closing routes might even be seen as interfering with divine will or abandoning responsibility. As the plague moved, it did not follow a single path. It spread outward from multiple points, carried along intersecting networks. From Egypt, it moved north to the Levant and westward across the Mediterranean. From inland regions, it reached coastal ports. Each movement reinforced the next, creating overlapping waves rather than a single front. Because the disease traveled at the speed of commerce, it often arrived in cities already accustomed to frequent arrivals. There was no dramatic moment of entry, no clear first case that could be identified with certainty. Instead, illness appeared gradually, embedded within normal patterns of life. This made early containment nearly impossible, even if the concept had existed. By the time a city noticed increased deaths, multiple routes of transmission were already established. Trade networks were not but web-like. Cutting one thread did little if others remained active. The same networks that supported imperial ambition thus became conduits for disaster. Justinian's reconquests relied on shipping grain to feed troops and civilians alike. His legal reforms depended on communication between provinces. His religious policies required travel by clergy and officials. All of these activities continued as planned, reinforcing the spread of disease. It is important to understand that no one involved perceived these routes as dangerous. They were familiar, necessary, and trusted. The idea that the empire's greatest strength could also be its greatest weakness was not part of contemporary thinking. As reports accumulated, some noticed patterns. Ports seemed harder hit than inland towns. Trade centers suffered more than isolated villages, but these observations remained local. Without a broader framework, they did not coalesce into a clear understanding. Merchants continued to travel because stopping would have meant financial ruin. Sailors continued to sail because it was their livelihood. Officials continued to approve shipments because cities depended on them. Each individual decision made sense within its context. Together, they sustained a system that allowed the plague to move freely. The disease itself adapted well to this environment. It did not require deliberate transport. It needed only proximity, time, and hosts. Rats found shelter wherever grain was stored. Fleas moved easily between animals and humans. Crowded living conditions amplified transmission. Trade routes ensured that once established, the disease could relocate again and again. As the plague approached Constantinople, it did so not as a foreign invader, but as a familiar presence, disguised within normal commerce. Ships arrived as they always had. Cargo was unloaded as usual. People went about their work. The silent passengers went unnoticed. This invisibility delayed recognition. There was no single moment when the city could have closed its gates and declared an emergency. By the time illness became widespread, the disease had already passed through multiple layers of society. Trade routes in this sense were not merely channels of movement, they were expressions of trust. Trust that goods would arrive, trust that systems would hold, trust that the world operated according to known rules. The plague exploited that trust without intention or awareness. It simply moved where opportunity allowed. In the coming sections, we will see how the disease's arrival transformed daily life, challenged belief, and strained governance. But it is here along these ordinary routes that the story truly takes shape. The Justinian plague did not descend from nowhere. It traveled patiently, step by step, along the very paths that sustained the empire's life. The first signs in the east, long before Constantinople understood that it was facing a crisis unlike any it had known, the earliest signs appeared far from the imperial capital, in regions where illness was common enough to escape immediate alarm. These first signs did not announce themselves with clarity. They emerged unevenly, scattered across ports, towns, and villages that were accustomed to hardship and accustomed to death. In these places, the plague did not arrive as a single unmistakable event, but as a troubling pattern that only became visible in hindsight. Egypt was among the first regions where the disease left a noticeable trace. This was not surprising, though no one at the time would have seen it that way. Egypt was densely populated along the Nile, intensely connected to trade networks, and central to the empire's food supply. Grain moved from inland farms to river ports, then to coastal harbors, then onward acro. Mediterranean. Each step brought people, animals, and stored goods into close contact. Reports from Egyptian towns spoke of sudden illness and unexpected deaths. People who had been working normally fell sick within days. Fever appeared quickly, swelling followed. Death often came before physicians could attempt treatment. At first, these cases were interpreted as local outbreaks, perhaps linked to climate, water, or seasonal change. Egypt was familiar with disease cycles. Floods altered conditions each year. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses were known hazards of life along the river. Local officials recorded deaths, as they always had. Priests led prayers. Families mourned. The machinery of daily life adjusted slightly, but did not stop. Fields still needed tending. Grain still needed shipping. The dead were buried, and the living carried on. What made this outbreak different was not immediately obvious. Mortality was higher, but not uniformly so. Some villages were struck hard, while others nearby were spared. Time passed, and new cases appeared in different locations, sometimes weeks later. This irregularity made the illness difficult to categorize. It did not move like a flood or a fire. It appeared, disappeared, then returned. From Egypt, signs of the disease appeared in ports along the eastern Mediterranean. Alexandria, with its immense harbor and constant traffic, was particularly vulnerable. Sailors fell ill shortly. After arrival, dock workers who handled cargo began to die. Taverns near the port lost patrons not to travel, but to sickness. Still, these events blended into the background noise of urban life. Ports were always unhealthy places by reputation. Merchants carried stories as they traveled, but stories changed with each retelling. One port was said to be cursed, another blamed spoiled grain, another spoke of divine displeasure. Without a unifying explanation, these accounts remained fragments rather than warnings. Medical practitioners in these regions observed symptoms that troubled them. Swellings appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. Fevers were intense and sudden. Delirium was common. Death often followed within days. These features did not match the most familiar illnesses. Physicians attempted treatments based on established theory, balancing humors, adjusting diet, bleeding, applying pickeys. Results were inconsistent at best. Despite this, there was no immediate sense of an unfolding disaster. Medicine, in the ancient and medieval worlds, was accustomed to uncertainty. Some patients recovered, others did not. Outcomes varied widely, even within the same household. Without tools to identify pathogens or transmission mechanisms, physicians focused on individual cases rather than population-level patterns. Religious explanations filled the gap. Communities interpreted illness through familiar frameworks of sin, testing, and divine will. Days of prayer were proclaimed. Processions were held. Alms were distributed. These actions provided structure and meaning, even if they did not alter the disease's course. As the months passed, the illness moved along, established roots. From Egypt, it spread eastward and northward, reaching Syria, Palestine, and Anatolia. Inland towns connected to ports by roads and caravans began to report similar symptoms. Again, the spread was uneven. Some places experienced brief outbreaks that subsided. Others suffered sustained mortality. Communication between provinces was slow and filtered. Letters took weeks to travel. Reports were summarized, abbreviated, and sometimes delayed. By the time an official in Constantinople received notice of increased deaths in a distant region, the situation there might already have changed. This lag blunted urgency. Moreover, imperial administration was accustomed to managing crisis. Famines, floods, and rebellions occurred regularly. Each had its procedures and remedies. Disease, though feared, was not unusual enough to prompt immediate centralized intervention unless it threatened taxation or military readiness directly. Trade continued. Grain shipments from Egypt did not stop because stopping them would have endangered the capital itself. Ships sailed with the same crews, carried the same cargo, and docked at the same ports. The disease traveled quietly with them, not as a deliberate threat, but as a biological consequence of movement. In these early stages, the plague's most significant feature was its ambiguity. It did not yet appear as a single coherent phenomenon. It looked like many local problems rather than one systemic crisis. This fragmentation delayed recognition and response. In some regions, local leaders attempted isolation measures. Sick households were avoided, travelers were viewed with suspicion, markets thinned temporarily, but these actions were inconsistent and difficult to sustain. Economic necessity and social obligation pulled people back into contact. The countryside responded differently from cities. In rural areas, populations were more dispersed. Illness spread more slowly. Some villages escaped entirely, reinforcing the belief that the disease was selective or random rather than universally threatening. This uneven impact undermined the idea that drastic measures were needed. Yet, even as uncertainty persisted, the number of deaths accumulated. Burial grounds filled faster than usual. Labor shortages appeared in specific trades. These changes were noticed, but interpreted locally. A town might attribute its losses to misfortune rather than contagion. What made the eastern regions particularly important was not only that they experienced the plague early, but that they were deeply connected to the rest of the empire. Egypt's role as the primary grain supplier meant that its health was inseparable from Constantinople's survival. Syria and Anatolia were military and administrative hubs. Movement through these regions was constant. As illness continued, officials faced difficult choices. Halting movement would have disrupted supply chains and military operations. Continuing movement risked spreading disease further. Without clear evidence or precedent, most chose continuity. This choice was reinforced by political pressure. The emperor's campaigns depended on steady flow of resources. Provincial governors were expected to maintain order and revenue. The plague did not provoke rebellion or open unrest. At this stage, people were frightened, but fear had not yet turned into despair. Faith, habit, and authority still held. It is also important to note that the plague did not strike only the poor or only the vulnerable. Reports described illness among sailors, merchants, clergy, laborers, and officials alike. This lack of discrimination unsettled observers. Disease that followed social lines could be rationalized. Disease that ignored them was harder to understand. As time passed, some observers began to sense that something unusual was happening. The recurrence of illness in waves, the similarity of symptoms across distant regions, and the scale of death suggested a shared cause. But without a framework to connect these observations, they remained impressions rather than conclusions. By the time the disease reached the outskirts of Constantinople, it had already traveled for years. It had tested responses in smaller cities and towns. It had revealed the limits of medical practice and religious explanation. It had exposed the vulnerability of trade networks without yet prompting their closure. For the people of the eastern provinces, the plague was already a lived reality before it became an imperial crisis. They adapted as best they could, drawing on familiar tools. Some survived, many did not. Their experience, though largely invisible in later histories, shaped the course of events by allowing the disease to move onward, carried by necessity and habit. These first signs in the East were not ignored so much as misunderstood. They did not fit existing categories, and so they were absorbed into routine rather than recognized as transformative. This misunderstanding was not foolishness. It was the result of living in a world where continuity had always outlasted disruption. As the plague continued its slow advance, the lessons of these early outbreaks would soon become painfully clear. But at this stage, they remained unlearned, scattered across regions recorded in fragments, and overshadowed by the daily demands of empire. The eastern provinces bore the first weight of the Justinian plague, quietly, without knowing that they were witnessing the opening phase of one of history's most consequential pandemics. Their experience formed the unseen foundation upon which the later crisis in Constantinople would unfold. Arrival in Constantinople. When the plague finally reached Constantinople, it did not arrive with a single moment of clarity. There was no announcement, no unmistakable turning point that separated normal life from crisis. Instead, the disease blended into the city's existing rhythms, indistinguishable at first from the ordinary illnesses that accompanied trade, travel, and seasonal change. This quiet entry would shape how the city experienced the catastrophe that followed. The capital was accustomed to receiving people and goods from every corner of the empire. Ships arrived daily from Egypt, Syria, the Iron, and beyond. Crews disembarked, cargo was unloaded, paperwork completed, and the vessels prepared for return voyages. Dock workers moved quickly and efficiently, handling grain sacks, crates, and personal belongings. These processes were routine, practiced, and trusted. No one stood at the harbor watching for danger. Early cases appeared near these ports, though no one could say exactly when. A sailor taken ill after unloading cargo, a porter collapsing in a warehouse, a household near the docks losing more members than expected within a short span of days. These incidents were noticed, but not yet connected. Ports had always been unhealthy places. Illness among sailors was expected, even if regrettable. Physicians were called, and they responded as they always had. They examined patients, noted symptoms, and prescribed treatments, grounded in accepted medical understanding. Fever was addressed with cooling measures. Swellings were treated with piticases. Dietary adjustments were recommended. Some patients improved. Many did not. The inconsistency was troubling but not unprecedented. The city's administrative machinery did not shift immediately. Officials continued their duties. Grain distribution schedules remained unchanged. Markets stayed open. Religious services continued, offering comfort rather than warning. The empire's confidence in its routines acted as a buffer against alarm. As cases increased, patterns began to emerge, though slowly. Illness clustered in certain neighborhoods, particularly those near harbors and major roads. Crowded living conditions amplified transmission. Multi-story buildings housed many families sharing limited space. Storage rooms filled with grain and goods attracted rodents. These conditions had existed for generations without causing catastrophe, which made it difficult to accept that they now posed a threat. Death rates rose evenly. Some streets were hit hard, while others nearby seemed unaffected. This irregularity confused observers. A disease that could devastate one area and spare another did not fit easily into existing explanations. People searched for reasons: air quality, water sources, moral conduct, divine favor. Each explanation accounted for some cases and failed to explain others. As weeks passed, the increase in deaths became undeniable. Burial grounds filled more quickly than usual. Funeral processions became more frequent. Clergy were called upon repeatedly to perform last rites. Families mourned privately and publicly. Still, the city as a whole continued to function, absorbing loss without yet acknowledging its scale. One reason for this delayed recognition was the sheer size of Constantinople. In a smaller town, a sudden increase in deaths would have been obvious. In a city of hundreds of thousands, loss could be distributed across neighborhoods in ways that masked its severity. Daily life continued because enough people remained healthy to sustain it. The plague symptoms became more widely known as cases multiplied. Fever appeared suddenly and intensely. Swellings developed, often painful and alarming. Delirium was common, and death followed swiftly in many cases. The speed of progression unsettled both physicians and families. Illness that killed within days challenged assumptions about recovery and care. Rumors spread alongside disease. Some claimed the illness came from corrupted grain, others blamed foreign merchants or divine punishment. These stories circulated in markets, churches, and households, providing a sense of explanation, even when evidence was thin. Rumor did not cause panic at first. It offered reassurance that the world was still understandable. The emperor's court received reports of increased mortality. Officials compiled numbers, though records were incomplete and uneven. Deaths among laborers were easier to overlook than deaths among administrators or soldiers. As the latter increased, concern deepened. The machinery of governance depended on people who could no longer be replaced easily. Despite growing concern, drastic measures were slow to appear. Closing the city's ports would have endangered the grain supply. Restricting movement within the city would have disrupted commerce and administration. The risks of intervention were immediate and clear. The risks of inaction were still uncertain. Religious responses intensified. Public prayers were organized. Processions moved through streets, calling on divine mercy. Churches filled with worshippers, seeking protection and meaning. These gatherings brought comfort, but they also increased proximity, further enabling the spread of disease. This unintended consequence was not understood at the time. Medical practitioners struggled with exhaustion and doubt. They worked long hours, moving from house to house, often falling ill themselves. Some withdrew from practice out of fear. Others continued despite the risk, driven by duty or faith. Their treatments remained largely unchanged because alternatives did not exist. As mortality increased, practical challenges mounted. Bodies accumulated faster than families could manage. Traditional burial practices strained under the volume. Graves filled quickly. Workers tasked with burial became scarce as they fell ill or died. The city faced the unsettling reality that even its systems for death were under pressure. The state intervened to organize burial on a larger scale. Officials designated sites and assigned workers. This intervention acknowledged the seriousness of the situation without fully articulating its cause. It was a pragmatic response rather than a conceptual shift. Economic effects followed quickly. Labor shortages appeared in trades essential to daily life. Prices fluctuated. Some goods became scarce while others piled up unused. Merchants faced uncertainty. Craftsmen closed workshops temporarily. These disruptions were uneven, creating pockets of hardship amid continued activity. Fear began to spread more widely. Though it did not yet dominate, people avoided certain neighborhoods. Travelers were viewed with suspicion. Some families withdrew into their homes. Others continued as before, trusting that fate or faith would protect them. The city contained all these responses simultaneously. One of the most unsettling aspects of the plague's arrival was its apparent randomness. People of different ages, professions, and social status fell ill. Wealth offered little protection. Authority offered none. This challenged deeply held assumptions about order and justice. If disease could strike anyone, what did that imply about the world's structure? The emperor himself remained engaged with governance, issuing orders and reviewing reports. At this stage, he was not yet personally affected by illness. His presence reassured the court and the city. As long as the emperor functioned, the empire felt intact. Yet beneath this surface continuity, strain accumulated. Officials faced decisions without precedent. Religious leaders offered explanations that comforted but did not resolve. Physicians confronted limits they could not overcome. Ordinary people balanced fear with necessity, continuing to work, shop, and worship because survival required it. As months passed, the plague entrenched itself. It was no longer an isolated outbreak or a temporary disturbance. It became part of the city's daily reality. Death was expected rather than exceptional. Illness was anticipated rather than surprising. This normalization of catastrophe is one of the most striking features of the plague's arrival in Constantinople. Rather than provoking immediate collapse, it settled into the city's rhythms, tearing them gradually. The city adapted even as it suffered, maintaining a semblance of order amid loss. By the time the full scale of mortality became clear, the plague had already reshaped the city's population and institutions. There was no return to an earlier moment of choice. The disease had passed beyond the point where it could be managed as a temporary crisis. Constantinople, the heart of the empire, had become a focal point of suffering, not because it was weak, but because it was connected. Its openness, density, and efficiency had allowed it to thrive. Those same goings now amplified disaster. The arrival of the plague marked the end of one kind of confidence and the beginning of a long period of adjustment. The city would continue to function, but it would never again assume that continuity was guaranteed. From this point forward, survival would require not only faith in systems, but endurance in the face of their limits. The plague had arrived quietly, embedded in the ordinary flow of life. Its presence would soon force Constantinople to confront realities that law, faith, and administration alone could not resolve. Illness, fear, and daily life. As the plague settled into Constantinople, it did not replace daily life so much as seep into it. Routines continued, but they did so under a growing weight of uncertainty that touched nearly every aspect of existence. People still woke in the morning, still prepared food, still went to work or prayer when they could. Yet each familiar action now carried an unspoken question about safety, risk, and endurance. Life did not stop. It narrowed. In households across the city, illness altered the rhythm of days. A family might wake to find one member feverish and confused, their condition worsening by the hour. Others watched closely for swelling, for sudden weakness, for signs that the sickness had arrived again. When symptoms appeared, the response was immediate, but limited. Physicians were called if available. Remedies were prepared, prayers were offered. Often there was little else to do but wait. Waiting became a common state. Families waited to see if illness would claim another life. Neighbors waited to learn whether a nearby household had been spared or struck. Employers waited to see whether workers would arrive. The city waited for signs that the outbreak was easing. Though no clear signal ever came, fear took many forms and it did not affect everyone equally. Some people responded by withdrawing as much as possible. They avoided markets when they could, limited visitors, and stayed indoors. Others had no such choice. Dock workers, bakers, water carriers, and burial workers could not retreat without abandoning their livelihoods. For them, fear existed, alongside necessity, managed rather than resolved. Public spaces changed subtly. Markets remained open, but they were quieter. Conversations were shorter. People kept more distance when possible, though crowded conditions often made this difficult. The sound of bargaining was still present, but it carried less ease. Shoppers moved quickly, focusing on essentials rather than lingering. Religious life intensified, though it, too, was altered. Churches filled more often, not just on feast days, but during ordinary hours. People sought comfort in familiar rituals, lighting candles, touching icons, repeating prayers learned in childhood. Clergy offered reassurance and interpretation, framing the crisis within a moral and spiritual context that emphasized endurance and humility. At the same time, religious gatherings brought people into close contact. This contradiction was not understood as such. To gather for prayer was seen as protective rather than dangerous. Faith offered meaning when medicine failed, and meaning mattered deeply. Even those who doubted found themselves drawn to shared ritual simply to feel less alone. Medical practice strained under the volume of illness. Physicians worked beyond exhaustion, moving from home to home, often without adequate rest or protection. Some fell ill and died. Others withdrew either out of fear or because their efforts seemed futile. This withdrawal was not universal, but it was noticeable. The city's capacity to care for the sick diminished as the number of sick increased. Home care became the norm. Family members nursed one another, learning through experience rather than instruction. They recognized symptoms, adjusted diets, and tried to keep the ill comfortable. When death came, it often did so in private spaces, without ceremony beyond immediate prayer. Grief accumulated quietly. Families lost parents, children, siblings, sometimes in quick succession. Mourning rituals were abbreviated out of necessity. Funerals became simpler, faster, less attended. The emotional weight of repeated loss was heavy, but there was little time to process it. Survival demanded attention to the present. Children experienced the plague differently. Some were spared, at least. Others fell ill like adults. Those who survived witnessed a world reshaped by absence. Familiar faces disappeared. Schools closed or functioned irregularly. Apprenticeships were interrupted. Childhood continued, but within a narrower, more uncertain environment. Workplaces adapted unevenly. Some trades collapsed temporarily as workers died or withdrew. Others became more essential than ever. Bakers, water carriers, and burial workers found themselves overwhelmed by demand. Their work was dangerous, but indispensable. The city depended on them even as it failed to protect them. The state attempted to maintain order through story stops. The state attempted to issue tedious directives, elect taxes where possible, and oversee supply distribution. But enforcement was inconsistent. With fewer workers and increased fear, compliance varied. Some obligations were postponed, others were quietly ignored. Economic disparities became more visible. Wealthier households could stockpile food, hire caretakers, and retreat into private spaces. Poorer families lived in crowded conditions, sharing wells and facilities, unable to isolate. This difference did not guarantee survival for the wealthy, but it shaped experience. Exposure was not equal. Fear also reshaped social behavior. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Travelers were avoided. Even neighbors became potential threats. At the same time, acts of generosity persisted. Some shared food, others cared for the sick outside their families. These actions were not organized, but spontaneous, arising from personal conviction rather than policy. The soundscape of the city changed. Bells rang more often for funerals. Streets fell quiet for stretches of the day. The usual noise of commerce diminished. At night, the city felt emptier. Lamps flickered in fewer windows. Silence became familiar. Rumors circulated constantly. Some claimed the disease had a natural cause tied to air or water. Others blamed moral decay, foreign influence, or divine anger. These explanations competed rather than replaced one another. People chose the version that made sense to them, or that offered the most comfort. Fear did not always lead to panic. In many cases, it resignation. People accepted risk as unavoidable. They continued to live because living was all they could do. This resignation was not indifference. It was a coping mechanism, a way to preserve sanity in the absence of control. Public order was tested, but not entirely broken. Crime did not surge dramatically, though theft increased in some areas. Guards continued to patrol where possible. The hippodrome, once a center of communal energy, fell largely silent. Large gatherings became rare, not because they were banned, but because enthusiasm had drained away. Time itself felt different. Days blurred together, marked less by events than by losses. Feast days passed quietly. Anniversaries went unobserved. The calendar still existed, but it no longer structured emotion in the same way. One of the most profound changes was psychological. The assumption that tomorrow would resemble today weakened. People planned less. They focused on immediate needs. Long-term projects were postponed or abandoned. This narrowing of outlook was subtle but pervasive. Yet, even in this narrowed world, continuity persisted. Bread was still baked, water was still drawn, children still played when they could. The city did not collapse into chaos. It endured, altered, but intact. This endurance came at a cost. Exhaustion became widespread. Not just physical exhaustion, but emotional fatigue. Constant vigilance wore people down. The repeated cycle of hope and loss eroded resilience. As illness continued, fear became less acute, but more ingrained. It was no longer a reaction to new cases, but a background condition. People adjusted to it as they adjusted to scarcity or hardship. This adjustment allowed life to continue, but it also masked the full scale of suffering. By this stage, the plague was no longer an external threat. It was woven into daily life. It shaped decisions, interactions, and expectations. The city's identity shifted from confidence to endurance. Illness had transformed not only bodies but relationships. Trust became conditional. Proximity became a calculation. Community persisted, but it was strained, cautious, quieter. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually as each household, each street, each neighborhood adapted in its own way. There was no single response, only many small adjustments layered upon one another. The result was a city still alive, still functioning, but changed at its core. The Justinian plague did not destroy daily life outright. It reshaped it, narrowing possibilities, redefining normality, and embedding fear into the fabric of existence. In this altered daily life, people learned to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. They did not overcome fear, but they carried it day after day as part of what it now meant to live in Constantinople, medicine and belief. As the plague continued its steady presence in Constantinople, people searched for understanding in the places where understanding had always been found. Medicine, religion, tradition, and memory. These systems did not compete so much as overlap, each offering partial explanations and partial comfort. Together they shaped how the city interpreted illness, responded to suffering, and endured uncertainty. Medicine in the 6th century Roman world was grounded in long-established theory. Physicians were trained in the works of earlier Greek and Roman writers, especially those who emphasized balance within the body. Health was understood as the proper harmony of humans, influenced by diet and environment and lifestyle. Disease was thought to arise when this balance was disturbed. This framework had guided medical practice for centuries and had proven useful for many conditions. When plague symptoms appeared, physicians approached them through this lens. Fever suggested excess heat, swellings indicated localized imbalance or corrupted fluids. Delirium implied disturbance of the mind, caused by bodily dysfunction. Treatments followed accordingly. Cooling measures were applied. Bloodletting was sometimes used to restore balance. Pickeases were placed on swellings in the hope of drawing out harmful substances. Diets were adjusted to favor foods believed to counteract excesses. These treatments were not random. They were systematic, based on established knowledge and experience. Physicians observed patients closely, adjusted remedies, and recorded outcomes when possible. Yet the plague resisted these efforts. Some patients recovered unexpectedly, others deteriorated rapidly despite care. The lack of consistent results unsettled practitioners, but it did not immediately invalidate their methods. Medicine had always involved uncertainty. The scale of the outbreak, however, introduced new challenges. Physicians were overwhelmed by the number of cases. They moved constantly between households, often without rest. Many lacked adequate supplies. Others fell ill themselves. The medical workforce shrank at the moment it was most needed. This strain limited not only treatment, but observation. Patterns that might have been noticed under calmer circumstances were lost amid urgency. As medical explanations faltered, belief systems took on greater importance. Christianity offered a framework that emphasized endurance, humility, and hope beyond earthly life. Illness could be interpreted as a test, a punishment, or a mystery beyond human understanding. None of these interpretations required precise causation. They required faith. Church leaders responded by increasing religious activity. Prayers were offered publicly and privately. Fasting was dory. Stops, processions moved through streets, carrying relics and chanting familiar texts. These acts reinforced communal identity and provided emotional structure. In a world where outcomes could not be controlled, ritual offered stability. The relationship between medicine and belief was not adversarial. Many physicians were themselves devout. Many clergy supported medical treatment. The two systems addressed different aspects of suffering. Medicine focused on the body. Religion addressed meaning, fear, and hope. People moved between them as needed, consulting doctors and attending services without perceiving contradiction. Yet, belief could also complicate response. Some interpreted a plague as divine will that could not be resisted. If illness was sent by God, intervention might seem futile or even inappropriate. Others believed that increased devotion would bring relief, encouraging larger gatherings rather than isolation. These interpretations were sincere and deeply rooted in tradition. Alternative explanations circulated as well. Some blamed environmental factors, corrupted air, unusual weather, or astronomical events were suggested causes. These ideas drew on ancient traditions that linked heal to cosmic balance. Such explanations did not necessarily lead to effective prevention, but they provided a sense of order. Folk practices also persisted. Amulets were worn. Certain herbs were carried or burned. Household rituals were performed to ward off illness. These practices varied widely and were often localized. They offered comfort rather than cure, reinforcing the feeling that one was doing something rather than nothing. The state did not impose a single interpretation. Imperial authority focused on maintaining order and essential functions rather than defining belief. Religious leaders held influence, But doctrine was not adjusted specifically in response to the plague. Instead, existing teachings were applied to new circumstances. One of the most difficult challenges was explaining why some survived while others did not. Medicine could not predict outcomes. Belief could not fully justify apparent randomness. People searched for patterns, moral behavior, piety, social status. None provided consistent answers. This uncertainty strained confidence in both systems. Despite this, neither medicine nor belief collapsed. They adapted. Physicians continued to treat patients, refining techniques where possible. Clergy continued to offer guidance, emphasizing patience and charity. The persistence of these systems mattered. They prevented despair from becoming total. Hospitals and charitable institutions played a role, though limited by capacity. Religious communities organized care for the sick and burial for the dead. These efforts were uneven but meaningful. They demonstrated that compassion could persist even when cure could not. Medical texts from the period reflect attempts to understand the plague retrospectively. Observations were recorded, symptoms described, and theories proposed. These writings did not produce immediate solutions, but they contributed to a gradual accumulation of knowledge that would influence later generations. Belief systems also evolved, subtly. Emphasis shifted toward humility and acceptance. The idea that human control had limits became more prominent. This shift did not undermine faith. It reshaped it, lining expectation with experience. For ordinary people, the interplay of medicine and belief shaped daily decisions. When illness appeared, they sought help where they could. They followed medical advice when available. They prayed when medicine failed. They did both when possible. This pragmatic approach reflected lived reality rather than ideological commitment. The plague exposed the boundaries of knowledge without eliminating its value. Medicine could alleviate suffering, even when it could not cure. Belief could provide meaning even when it could not explain. Together they allowed people to endure. As months turned into years, this endurance became normalized. The presence of disease no longer prompted urgent explanation. It became part of the world's texture, something to be managed rather than understood fully. This acceptance did not mean indifference. Suffering remained real, loss remained painful. But people learned to live within uncertainty, drawing on familiar systems to maintain stability. In this way, medicine and belief functioned less as solutions and more as supports. They held individuals and communities upright when certainty was impossible. They prevented collapse by offering structure. The Justinian plague did not produce a medical revolution or a religious schism. It revealed the limits of existing frameworks while affirming their necessity. People needed explanations, even imperfect ones. They needed rituals even when outcomes did not change. As the plague continued, these systems would be tested further, especially when leadership itself was affected. The illness would so unreach the emperor, forcing the highest levels of authority to confront vulnerability directly. But at this stage, medicine and belief remained the primary tools through which the city understood and endured the crisis. They did not stop the plague, but they shaped the human experience of it, turning chaos into something that could be lived through day by day. Justinian falls ill. As the plague continued its long presence in Constantinople, it reached a moment that carried both symbolic and practical weight, the illness of the emperor himself. Until this point, Justinian had remained physically removed from the worst effects of the disease, even as reports of death and disruption accumulated around him. His continued health had served as a quiet reassurance that the structures of power still stood firm. When that reassurance failed, the impact was felt far beyond the walls of the palace. Justinian's illness did not begin dramatically. Like so many others, it started with symptoms that could easily be mistaken for something temporary: fever, fatigue, weakness. At first, there was no public announcement. The court functioned as it always had, maintaining discretion and order. The machinery of governance continued, though increasingly through intermediaries. As the emperor's condition worsened, it became impossible to conceal. Swellings appeared, unmistakable to those who had seen the disease elsewhere in the city. Physicians were summoned immediately, including the most experienced practitioners available. They applied the same methods used throughout the city, though with greater care and attention. Treatments were administered repeatedly. Diet was controlled. The emperor was kept isolated within the palace, surrounded by attendants who balanced duty with fear. News of Justinian's illness spread quickly, despite efforts to manage information. In a city already anxious, rumors moved faster than official statements. Some exaggerated his condition, others denied it outright. Still others interpreted it as a sign of divine judgment or impending collapse. The illness of the emperor became a canvas onto which fears and hopes were projected for the court. The situation created immediate uncertainty. Justinian had not named a clear successor, prepared to assume power at a moment's notice. His authority rested not only on his title, but on his constant involvement in decision-making. Without him, even temporarily, the flow of orders slowed. Officials hesitated, uncertain how much initiative they could take, without explicit approval. This hesitation revealed how centralized governance had become. Justinian's style emphasized direct oversight. Laws, appointments, and military decisions often required his personal attention. In normal times, this ensured consistency. In crisis, it created vulnerability. The emperor's illness also highlighted the limits of privilege. Despite access to the best care available, Justinian faced the same uncertainty as his subjects. Treatments that had failed elsewhere offered no guaranteed protection within the palace. This reality undermined assumptions about the protective power of wealth and status. Religious responses intensified around the palace. Clergy prayed for the emperor's recovery, both privately and publicly. Special services were held. The health of the ruler was inseparable from the perceived health of the empire. His survival mattered not only personally, but symbolically. At the same time, political calculation did not disappear. Courtiers observed one another carefully. Alliances were reassessed. Potential successes were quietly evaluated. No open struggle emerged, but the atmosphere was tense. The possibility of sudden transition hovered over every interaction. Outside the palace, the member's illness had a complex effect. For some, it deepened fear. If even Justinian could fall ill, no one was safe. For others, it brought a strange sense of shared experience. The ruler now endured what countless families had already faced. This did not already face suffering, but it altered perception. The administration attempted to project continuity. Orders continued to be issued in the emperor's name. Officials emphasized stability. Grain distribution remained a priority. Military commands were maintained. These efforts were deliberate, aimed at preventing panic or opportunism. Medical practitioners working with the emperor faced immense pressure. Failure carried not only personal risk but political consequences, yet they had little beyond established practice to offer. Their experience mirrored that of physicians throughout the city. Careful observation, repeated treatment, uncertain outcomes. The duration of Justinian's illness added to tension. Days stretched into weeks. At times his condition seemed to improve. At others it worsened. This fluctuation mirrored the plague itself, reinforcing the sense that control was elusive. During this period, governance slowed noticeably. Some decisions were postponed, others were delegated reluctantly. The emperor's absence from daily oversight exposed how dependent the system had become on his presence. This dependence had not been a problem before. Now it was. The court also faced practical challenges. Attendants fell ill or withdrew. Communication within the palace was restricted. Routine ceremonies were suspended. The palace, usually a center of activity, became quieter, more inward-focused. Justinian's illness forced a confrontation with mortality at the highest level of power. The emperor, who had devoted his reign to restoring and preserving the empire, now confronted the fragility of his own body. This confrontation was private, but its implications were public. When Justinian eventually recovered, the relief was immense. His survival was interpreted by many as a sign of divine favor. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered. The return of the emperor to active governance restored a sense of continuity that had been deeply shaken. Yet recovery did not erase the experience. The memory of vulnerability lingered. Justinian himself was changed by it. He resumed his duties, but with a clearer awareness of limits. The plague had demonstrated that no amount of planning or authority could guarantee safety. The period of his illness also left lasting marks on administration. Officials who had hesitated learned the cost of delay. Some structures were adjusted to allow limited autonomy, others remained centralized, reflecting a balance between control and necessity. For the broader population, the emperor's illness became part of the collective narrative of the plague. It was retold as evidence of shared suffering, divine testing, or resilience. It did not end the crisis, but it marked a turning point in perception. From this point forward, the plague was no longer something happening to others or to distant provinces. It had reached the center of power. Its legitimacy as a defining event was unquestionable. Justinian's recovery allowed the empire to continue functioning, but it did not restore earlier confidence. The assumption that the emperor's presence ensured stability had been broken. Stability now appeared contingent, dependent on endurance rather than certainty. The illness also reinforced the realization that the plague was not a brief episode. It was an extended condition, one that would shape years rather than months. Leadership would have to operate within this reality. In this sense, Justinian's initialness served as both crisis and lesson. It exposed vulnerability without causing collapse. It forced adaptation without revolution. It marked the moment when the plague became inseparable from imperial history, rather than a background disturbance. As the emperor returned to governance, the city continued to suffer. Death did not cease. Fear did not vanish. But the experience of leadership under illness reshaped how authority was exercised and perceived. The plague had tested the body of the emperor, just as it tested the body of the emperor. Just as it tested the body of the city, both survived, altered, but intact. From here, the challenge would not be survival alone, but the management of a world permanently changed by loss. Traditions, habits, and appearance in a plague-struck city. To understand how the people of Constantinople endured the plague, it helps to pause and look more closely at how they lived, dressed, moved, and structured their days. These traditions and habits did not disappear when illness arrived. Instead, they shaped how suffering was experienced and how endurance became possible. The plague unfolded not in abstraction, but within a very specific texture of daily life. Clothing in the 6th century Eastern Roman world reflected both continuity and hierarchy. Most people dressed in garments that were practical, layered, and familiar across generations. Tunics formed the foundation of dress for men and women alike. These were typically made of wool or linen, depending on season and means. Wool was more common, warmer, and durable. Linen was lighter and associated with comfort and cleanliness, though more expensive. Over the tunic, many wore cloaks, especially when outdoors. These cloaks were functional, rather than decorative, fastened at the shoulder, with a brooch and designed to protect against wind and rain. Color mattered. Bright dyes were costly and signaled status. Most people wore muted shades, off-white, brown, gray, or faded reds. Purple, brown, gray, or faded reds. Purple, closely associated with imperial authority, was strictly regulated. Its appearance immediately marked rank and proximity to power. During the plague, clothing took on additional meaning. Clean garments were associated with health and order, though frequent washing was difficult. People changed clothes less often when illness spread through households, both out of exhaustion and fear of handling contaminated fabric. Still, habits persisted. Dressing properly remained a sign of dignity, even in grief. Footwear was simple. Sandals in warmer months, closed shoes in colder seasons. Streets were uneven, often damp and crowded. Shoes wore out quickly. Repairing them was a common trade, one that continued throughout the plague, because movement could not stop entirely. Hair and grooming followed long-standing norms. Men typically wore their hair short and beards trimmed, though styles varied by region and profession. Clergy often maintained distinctive appearances, reinforcing identity even during crisis. Women covered their hair in public using veils or scarves, a practice rooted in custom and modesty. These habits did not vanish during the plague. They persisted because they provided familiarity when much else felt unstable. Daily routines were shaped by light, bells, and obligation. Most people rose early, especially those involved in labor. Bakers worked before dawn. Dock workers timed their efforts to ship arrivals. Market sellers prepared stalls. As the city woke, these rhythms continued, though sometimes with fewer participants. When illness removed workers, others stepped in, where possible, often untrained but willing. Meals were simple and regular. Bread formed the core of the diet, supplemented by vegetables, olives, cheese, and occasionally fish or meat. Shared meals reinforced family bonds. During the plague, eating together became more cautious. Some families separated the sick from the healthy during meals. Others had no space to do, so food preparation itself became a moment of anxiety, though necessity overrode fear. Social habits emphasized proximity. People were accustomed to sharing space. Homes, streets, baths, and churches, public baths, once central to urban life, became less frequented as fear of illness grew. Yet they did not close immediately. Cleanliness was valued, and the idea that bathing could be dangerous was not widely accepted. Gradually, attendance declined, not by decree, but by habit. Hospitality remained important. Visitors were traditionally welcomed with food and rest. During the plague, this custom strained. Turning someone away felt morally wrong, yet welcoming them felt risky. Families navigated this tension quietly, often making exceptions for close kin while avoiding strangers. Religious habits structured the week and year. Feast days, fasts, and saints' commemorations continued to mark time. Even when public celebrations diminished, private observance persisted. Lighting candles, reciting prayers, and observing fasts required little space or expense. These habits anchored people when larger gatherings became difficult. Clergy clothing distinguished them clearly. Robes, stole, and simple vestments marked religious authority. During the plague, clergy were highly visible, moving through the city to visit the sick and perform burials. Their dress made them recognizable and sometimes avoided. Yet many continued despite risk, their appearance reinforcing continuity of care. Children's habits changed subtly. They played less freely in streets when families restricted movement. Games moved indoors. Toys were simple wooden objects, balls, small figures. Childhood did not disappear, but it became quieter, more contained. Education, already limited to certain classes, became irregular. Learning continued formally within households. Work habits adapted unevenly. Some trades collapsed temporarily, others intensified. Burial workers, grave diggers, and clergy handling nary rites worked continuously. Their clothing became associated with death, and some avoided them, though their role was essential. Over time, their presence became normalized, another sign of how habits adjusted to crisis. Even gestures and posture mattered. People learned to keep slight distance when possible, though without formal rules. Touch, once casual, became selective. Handshakes diminished. Physical closeness became purposeful rather than automatic. These changes were subtle, rarely spoken aloud. Traditions around death were particularly strained. Washing the body, wrapping it in cloth, carrying it to burial. These acts were deeply ingrained. During the height of immortality, families shortened or simplified them. Still, some form of ritual was almost always observed. Even when burial was hurried, a prayer was spoken, a cloth used, a moment taken. These habits preserved humanity amid loss. Clothing for mourning was restrained. Darker garments signaled grief, though color conventions were less rigid than in later centuries. Repeated loss meant that many lived in extended mourning, their appearance quietly reflecting it. Despite everything, people continued to mark transitions. Births were celebrated quietly, marriages occurred, sometimes hastened by uncertainty. These events were smaller, more private, but they mattered deeply. Tradition persisted because it affirmed that life continued. What is most striking is how much endured. People did not reinvent daily life entirely. They modified it. They leaned on habit because habit required less energy than invention. Familiar clothes, familiar prayers, familiar routines offered stability when the future felt unpredictable. The plague altered the meaning of these traditions without erasing them. Clothing became a reminder of dignity. Habits became tools of survival. Customs became anchors. Through them, the people of Constantinople remained themselves, even as their world narrowed. In this way, tradition did not oppose change. It absorbed it. The city's identity persisted, not because it was untouched, but because it was adaptable. The plague tested every aspect of life, yet it was lived through the same gestures, garments, and routines that had shaped generations before. This continuity would prove essential as the city faced even greater strain, when death overwhelmed systems entirely, and when the scale of loss demanded responses beyond individual households. But even then, the habits formed long before the plague would continue to shape how the city endured what came next. Death and the city overwhelmed. As the plague reached its most severe phase in Constantinople, death ceased to be an interruption to daily life and became one of its defining features. What had once been an occasional event marked by ritual and reflection now pressed in on every household, every street, every institution. The city was not destroyed in a single moment, but it was overwhelmed gradually as the number of dead exceeded the capacity of custom, labor, and administration to respond. At first, families managed death as they always had. When someone died, relatives washed the body, wrapped it in cloth, and prepared it for burial. Prayers were spoken, neighbors gathered briefly. The dead were carried beyond the city walls to cemeteries that had long served the population. These practices were deeply ingrained and provided structure during grief. But as deaths multiplied, this structure strained. Households lost not one member but several. Sometimes within days, survivors found themselves caring for the sick while preparing the dead. Emotio, gnarl exhaustion, compounded physical fatigue. Grief no longer followed a period of illness and anticipation. It arrived suddenly, repeatedly, leaving little time to recover. Burial workers were among the first to be overwhelmed. Their numbers dwindled as illness claimed them or forced them to withdraw. The work itself became relentless. Graves were dug continuously. Tools wore out. The ground filled faster than expected. Cemeteries expanded outward, sometimes encroaching on farmland or unused land near the walls. When traditional burial sites reached capacity, authorities designated new areas. These decisions were practical, not ceremonial. The priority was containment and order, not symbolism. Bodies could not remain within the city. Decomposition posed health risks and emotional distress. Removal was essential. As the number of dead increased further, families struggled to meet expectations. Some households lacked the strength or manpower to carry bodies. Others feared handling the dead, believing contact might spread illness. These fears were not unfounded, though their mechanisms were not understood. The result was delay. Bodies remained in homes longer than tradition allowed. The presence of the dead within living spaces changed the atmosphere of the city. Streets that once carried commerce now carried processions at all hours. The in-sound of bells became constant. The smell of decay lingered in certain areas, especially during warmer months. Residents adapted by closing windows, burning incense, or retreating indoors. Religious leaders attempted to maintain dignity in death, but they too were overwhelmed. Clergy moved from home to home, offering prayers and rites. As numbers grew, ceremonies shortened. Words were repeated quickly, sometimes spoken collectively over multiple bodies. Individual attention gave way to collective necessity. The emotional toll of thigh shift was profound. Rituals that once helped people process loss now felt incomplete, yet abandoning them entirely was unthinkable. Even abbreviated rites mattered. They affirmed that the dead were still recognized as individuals even when time and energy were scarce. The state intervened as death overwhelmed private capacity. Officials organized burial teams, often recruiting from among prisoners, laborers, or those without family obligations. These workers were paid when possible and promised protection. Though such promises were difficult to keep, their role was dangerous but indispensable. Mass burial sites were created when individual graves were no longer feasible. Trenches were dug to receive multiple bodies. This practice was not entirely new. It had been used during wars and earlier crises, but its scale was unprecedented for the city. The sight of these trenches unsettled residents, confronting them with the magnitude of loss. Transporting bodies became a logistical challenge. Carts moved through streets regularly, collecting the dead. This sight, once rare, became familiar. People learned to step aside, avert their gaze, or offer brief prayers as carts passed. Children grew, accustomed to these scenes with troubling ease. As death became omnipresent, social distinctions blurred. Wealth did not guarantee proper burial. Rank did not ensure ceremony. Some prominent individuals received attention, but many did not. The sheer volume of death flattened hierarchy in practice, if not in memory. The pace of burial altered perceptions of time. Days were measured not by tasks completed, but by bodies removed. Progress was counted in the clearing of homes rather than the accomplishment of work. This shift reshaped priorities. Survival and sanitation took precedence over custom. The psychological impact of constant death was cumulative. People spoke less. Laughter became rare. Public spaces emptied, except for necessity. Fear gave way to numbness. This numbness was not indifference, but a protective response. To feel fully each loss would have been unbearable. Children were especially affected. Many lost parents or siblings. Others witnessed death regularly. Their understanding of the world adjusted quickly, absorbing loss as normal. This quiet adaptation would shape a generation, though its effects would not be fully visible for years. Animals also played a role in the city's overwhelmed state. Stray dogs scavenged where bodies were left unattended. Rats multiplied amid disrupted sanitation. These conditions reinforced fear and reinforced the sense that order was slipping, even as authorities worked to contain it. Despite everything, the city did not descend into chaos. There were no widespread riots, no complete breakdown of authority. This restraint was remarkable and owed much to habit, faith, and exhaustion. People lacked the energy to rebel. They focused on enduring. Officials faced grim choices. Resources were finite. Should efforts focus on burial, food distribution, or law enforcement? In most cases, burial and food took priority. The living needed to eat and the dead needed removal. Other functions became secondary. Documentation of death was inconsistent. Records could not keep pace. Numbers varied widely depending on source. What mattered less than accuracy was recognition that mortality was extraordinary. Everyone knew someone who had died. Many knew several. As weeks passed, the city adjusted to its new reality. Burial teams developed routines. Routes were established. Work continued with grim efficiency. This adaptation did not mean acceptance, but it allowed the city to function. Yet the normalization of mass death altered values subtly. Life felt more fragile. Plans felt provisional. The future felt uncertain. These perceptions would linger long after the worst waves passed. Death also reshaped physical space. Cemeteries expanded. Empty houses accumulated as entire families vanished. Neighborhoods changed character. Some streets grew quiet permanently. Others were repopulated slowly by newcomers or survivors, consolidating households. The memory of this period would endure in stories, sermons, and silent knowledge. People remembered the months when death overwhelmed the city, not as a single catastrophe, but as a prolonged strain that tested every aspect of life. In this way, the plague transformed Constantinople, not through sudden destruction, but through accumulation. Each death added weight until the city bent under it. Yet it did not break. It endured, scarred and altered, carrying the memory of loss forward into the centuries that followed. Death had overwhelmed the city, but it had not erased it. What remained was a quieter, more cautious place, shaped by the knowledge that even the greatest cities are vulnerable, and that survival depends not on avoiding death entirely, but on continuing despite it. Government under pressure. As the city struggled beneath the weight of death, the imperial government faced a different but related challenge: how to continue governing when the very people who made governance possible were disappearing. The Eastern Roman state was built on continuity, hierarchy, and procedure. It was not designed for sudden absence on a massive scale, yet absence became its defining condition. In theory, imperial authority flowed smoothly from the emperor through ministers and officials to the provinces and cities. In practice, this flow depended on countless individuals: scribes who copied orders, messengers who carried them, clerks who kept records, and local administrators who enforced decisions. As illness spread, the links weakened one by one. At first, the disruption was manageable. A sick claque could be replaced temporarily. A delayed message could wait. The bureaucracy had always accounted for ordinary illness and death, but the plague did not remove individuals in isolation. It removed them in clusters. Entire offices lost staff within weeks. Institutional memory vanished abruptly. The court in Constantinople attempted to abandon normal procedure as long as possible. Documents continued to be issued, with familiar language and seals. Orders were phrased as though conditions were ordinary. This choice was deliberate. Stability was communicated through form even when substance faltered. To change the tone of governance risked acknowledging loss of control. Taxation was among the most sensitive issues. The state required revenue to function. Especially during crisis, soldiers needed pay. Grain shipments required funding. Burial operations and public order demanded resources. Yet, taxpayers were dying, fleeing, or unable to work. Enforcing full taxation risked provoking unrest or simply proving impossible. In response, Justinian's administration made selective adjustments. Some taxes were deferred, others were reassessed. In regions hit hardest, collections slowed or stopped temporarily. These decisions were pragmatic rather than generous. The state could not extract what no longer existed. Flexibility became a necessity, even for a government accustomed to rigidity. Record-keeping suffered accordingly. Census data became outdated almost immediately. Registers of households no longer matched reality. Deaths outpaced documentation. Officials relied increasingly on estimates and local knowledge rather than formal records. This shift introduced error but allowed basic function to continue. Legal administration faced similar strain. Courts depended on judges, advocates, and clerks of wish. Were affected by illness. Cases accumulated. Hearings were postponed. In some instances, disputes were resolved informally or abandoned entirely. Justice did not cease, but it slowed and unevenly applied. This slowed and altered social expectations. People became less likely to pursue formal legal remedies. They relied more on negotiation, mediation, or resignation. This shift reduced pressure on courts, but weakened the sense of predictable order that law had provided. Military governance was also disrupted. Armies stationed across the empire experienced outbreaks of illness. Recruitment slowed. Training suffered. Commanders fell ill or died. Campaigns already underway were delayed or scaled back. These changes were rarely announced openly. Instead, they appeared as quiet adjustments in deployment and timing. Supply chains, supporting the military, strained under these conditions. Food, equipment, and pay moved less reliably. The government prioritized essential fronts, often at the expense of secondary operations. Strategic ambitions narrowed, not by declaration, but by necessity. Communication between the capital and provinces deteriorated. Messengers were fewer, travel was riskier, routes were disrupted, orders arrived late or not at all. Provincial governors acted with greater autonomy, making decisions based on local conditions rather than waiting for instruction. This autonomy was tolerated because alternatives were limited. Within Constantinople itself, public administration adapted unevenly. Some departments continued functioning with reduced staff. Others effectively ceased operation. Responsibilities were consolidated. Surviving officials took on multiple roles, often without formal authorization. This improvisation kept services running, but blurred lines of accountability. The emperor's role remained central. Justinian, having recovered from illness, resumed oversight with renewed urgency. He issued edicts addressing burial practices, taxation adjustments, and administrative continuity. These edicts acknowledged crisis without fully articulating its scale. Language emphasized order, duty, and endurance. Yet even imperial authority had limits. Enforcement depended on manpower. Compliance depended on capacity. Orders could not conjure workers or restore the dead. The government's power was constrained by reality more than by law. Public order required careful management. With guard numbers reduced, enforcement softened. Authorities focused on preventing large disturbances rather than punishing minor offenses. This pragmatic tolerance preserved peace, but altered expectations. Rules still existed, but their application was flexible. Food distribution remained the government's highest priority. Bread shortages could provoke unrest, even in stable times. During the plague, ensuring supply was essential to preventing collapse. Resources were diverted accordingly. Other services suffered, but bread continued to reach the population. Officials overseeing this distribution worked under extreme pressure. Delays or errors could have fatal consequences. They balanced fear of disease with fear of disorder. Their success was one of the reasons the city endured without widespread rebellion. Despite these efforts, confidence in government weakened subtly, not through anger, but through recognition of limitation. People saw that the state could not prevent death. It could manage consequences, but not causes. This realization reshaped the relationship between ruler and ruled. The bureaucracy itself internalized this lesson. Officials became more cautious. Long-term planning gave way to short-term survival. Innovation slowed. The government relied on familiar tools because unfamiliar ones required energy and coordination that were no longer available. Yet the state did not abandon its identity. It continued to issue laws, collect revenue where possible, and assert authority. This continuity mattered. It prevented fragmentation. It signaled that the empire still existed as a political entity, even if weakened. Over time, the government learned to function at reduced capacity. Offices reorganized, roles shifted, expectations adjusted. This adaptation did not restore pre-plague efficiency, but it allowed governance to persist. The pressure placed on government by the plague revealed both resilience and fragility. The system did not collapse, but it could not perform at previous levels. It survived by narrowing its focus and accepting imperfection. This experience would have lasting consequences. Tolerance for delay increased. Centralization loosened slightly as local autonomy became unavoidable. These shifts were subtle but enduring. In the midst of crisis, governance became less about ambition and more about maintenance. The goal was no longer expansion or reform, but survival. Keeping food flowing, burying the dead, and preventing unrest were achievements in themselves. As the plague continued, these pressures would intensify and spread beyond the capital. The empire as a whole would feel the strain, forcing further adaptation. But in Constantinople, the government's ability to endure under pressure was one of the key reasons the city survived its darkest period. The machinery of state emerged, altered but intact, carrying forward the memory of a time when authority faced its limits and learned reluctantly to operate within them. The countryside and food supply. While Constantinople struggled visibly under the burden of illness, death, and administrative strain, the countryside experienced the plague in a quieter but equally transformative way. Beyond the city walls lay the fields, villages, roads, and river routes that sustained urban life. These rural spaces did not collapse suddenly. Instead, they thinned, weakened, and adjusted over time, often without clear acknowledgement that a crisis was unfolding. The survival of the capital depended on these areas, and as the plague spread, that dependence became increasingly fragile. Agriculture in the Eastern Roman world was built on predictability. Seasons mattered more than dates. Farmers relied on inherited knowledge passed down through families and villages. Fields were planted at familiar times. Harvests were expected within known windows. Storage, transport, and taxation followed these rhythms closely. This system worked well when labor was stable and populations were steady. The plague disrupted both. In many rural regions, illness arrived later than in the cities. The lower population density slowed transmission, and some villages escaped initial waves entirely. This delay created a dangerous illusion of safety. Farmers continued working fields even as nearby towns struggled. When illness did appear, it often arrived suddenly, carried by traders, tax officials, or returning relatives. Its impact was uneven but immediate. A household struck by plague could lose its labor force within days. Farming tasks that required coordination and strength went unfinished. Fields lay partially planted. Crops were harvested too late or not at all. Unlike urban disruption, which was visible and immediate, agricultural failure unfolded quietly. A field left unattended did not cry out. It simply failed to produce. Surviving family members attempted to compensate. Children worked earlier than custom allowed. Elderly relatives returned to labor they had long abandoned. Neighbors assisted where possible, but this compensation had bracks. Plowing required animals and strength. Harvesting required coordination. When too many people were lost, effort alone could not replace them. Livestock suffered as well. Animals required daily care. When herders fell ill, animals wandered, starved, or were slaughtered prematurely. Loss of livestock reduced food supply and undermined future production. Oxen used for plowing were especially valuable. Their loss affected multiple seasons, not just one. Storage facilities became points of vulnerability. Grain needed dry, protected spaces, with fewer workers to maintain granaries. Spoilage increased, rodents multiplied, fleas thrived. These conditions reduced usable supply even when harvests were adequate. Transport from countryside to city grew unreliable. Carts required drivers. Roads required upkeep. River transport required crews. Each link in the chain weakened as illness spread. Grain that existed in the countryside sometimes failed to reach the city at all. In other cases, it arrived late, damaged, or reduced in quantity. Egypt's role as the empire's primary grain supplier magnified these effects. The Nile flood still occurred, but human systems managing harvest, storage, and shipment faltered. Labor shortages disrupted every stage. Administrative oversight weakened as officials died or withdrew. Grain continued to move northward, but not with the same consistency or volume. The state recognized the danger quickly. Grain shortages in Constantinople risked unrest. Officials prioritized shipments from Egypt above nearly all else. Reserves were tapped. Emergency measures were taken, yet these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. They bought time, not stability. Elsewhere in the empire, similar patterns emerged. In Anatolia, Syria, and the Balkans, rural production declined unevenly. Some areas retained enough labor to maintain output. Others suffered sharp decline. These regional differences created distorted markets. Surplus existed in some places but could not be moved efficiently. Scarcity existed in others despite nearby abundance. Taxation policies struggled to keep pace with reality. The state assessed taxes based on land and expected yield, not actual production. As farms failed or were abandoned, tax burdens became unrealistic. Justinian's administration adjusted burdens. Definian's administration adjusted, where possible, deferring or reducing assessments in heavily affected regions. These decisions were pragmatic rather than generous. The state needed functioning farms more than immediate revenue. However, enforcement varied. Some local officials showed flexibility. Others adhered strictly to policy. This inconsistency encouraged quiet evasion, and informal arrangements farmers negotiated privately. Obligations were postponed without documentation. The formal economy shrank as the informal expanded. Migration increased subtly. Families left abandoned villages for more stable regions. This movement was not dramatic or mass organized. It occurred household by household, guided by kinship and rumor. Some areas depopulated further, others absorbed newcomers. These shifts altered rural demographics in ways that would shape recovery. The relationship between countryside and city changed in tone. Rural producers viewed cities as dangerous, disease-ridden places. Urban officials viewed rural areas as unreliable. Yet mutual dependence remained absolute. Neither could survive without the other. For city residents, the countryside struggle was felt through markets. Bread remained available, but quality varied. Prices fluctuated. Variety declined. Diets narrowed further. Protein sources became scarce. Malnutrition increased, especially among the poor. This nutritional decline weakened resistance to disease, creating a cycle: illness, reduced labor. Reduced food worsened illness outcomes. The plague fed on his imbalance indirectly. Despite these pressures, complete famine in Constantinople was largely avoided. This survival reflected administrative focus and logistical endurance. The government prioritized food distribution above all else. It sacrificed other functions to preserve supply. This choice mattered. In rural areas, however, hardship was more severe and less visible. Some villages survived with reduced output, others collapsed entirely. Fields returned to scrub, houses stood empty. These changes were not temporary disruptions, they altered the landscape itself. Labor became more valuable as populations declined. Surviving workers gained leverage. Wages rose in some regions, landowners adjusted reluctantly. These shifts would eventually reshape rural society, though during the plague they appeared simply as necessity. The psychological impact on farmers was profound. A way of life built on continuity became uncertain. Long-term planning felt impossible. Risk perception changed. Survival replaced prosperity as the primary goal. Through all of this, the countryside endured quietly. Its suffering lacked the spectacle of urban death, but was no less consequential. Every failed harvest, every abandoned field, every delayed shipment shaped the city's fate. The empire survived not because the countryside was spared, but because enough of it endured, enough land was worked, enough grain moved, enough people remained to sustain the fragile system. This rural endurance formed the unseen backbone of imperial survival during the plague. Without it, Constantinople would have fallen into famine and disorder. With it, the city survived, altered, but intact. The plague spreads across empires. By the time the countryside began to falter under labor shortages and uneven harvests, the Justinian plague had already moved far beyond the borders of Constantinople. What began as a crisis is concentrated in the eastern Mediterranean, became a phenomenon that crossed political, cultural, and geographic boundaries. The disease did not recognize imperial frontiers, religious differences, or diplomatic agreements. It followed people, goods, and habits, wherever they went, reshaping the interconnected world of the 6th century in ways that would only become clear with time. The Eastern Roman Empire was not isolated. It existed within a web of neighboring powers, trade partners, rivals, and shared environments. Roads did not end at borders. Ships did not turn back at political boundaries. Merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, soldiers, and migrants moved continually between regions. This movement sustained economies and relationships, but it also allowed disease to spread without resistance. From Constantinople, the plague traveled westward along familiar maritime routes. Cities along the Iron and Adriatic coasts experienced outbreaks that mirrored those of the capital, though often on a smaller scale. Ports were struck first, then inland towns connected by roads and rivers. As in Constantinople, the illness appeared gradually, embedded within ordinary life before its severity became unmistakable. Italy, already weakened by years of war and political instability, suffered heavily. Urban centers such as Rome and Ravenna experienced sharp population loss. The plague compounded existing disruption caused by conflict between imperial forces and local powers. Administrative capacity was already strained, and the arrival of disease further reduced manpower, slowed recovery, and deepened uncertainty. In Gaul and Hispania, the plague's impact varied by region. Some areas experienced brief but intense outbreaks. Others faced recurring waves over years. Communication gaps and uneven record-keeping make precise measurement difficult, but archaeological and textual evidence suggests substantial mortality in key population centers. Rural regions often fared better initially, but they were not immune. Across the eastern frontier, the Persian Empire encountered the plague as well. Trade and warfare ensured contact between Roman and Persian territories, especially in border regions such as Mesopotamia. The disease moved along these shared routes, affecting cities on both sides. Like the Romans, Persian administrators struggled to maintain stability amid loss of life and labor. What is striking is not that the plague spread, but how predictably it followed existing connections. No new routes were created. No extraordinary movement was required. The same networks that had sustained diplomacy, commerce, and culture now carried disease. The interconnected world revealed its vulnerability. Local responses differed according to tradition and governance. Some regions emphasized religious explanation. Others relied more heavily on medical or administrative measures. Yet the outcomes were similar. Mortality disrupted social order. Labor shortages affected production. Confidence in long-term stability weakened. In many places, the plague arrived in waves, rather than as a single event. An initial outbreak would subside only to return years later. These recurrences prevented full recovery. Just as populations began to stabilize, new losses occurred. This pattern exhausted communities and discouraged rebuilding. Trade patterns shifted subtly as a result. Merchants became more cautious. Routes perceived as dangerous were avoided when alternatives existed. Some markets declined permanently. Others adapted by narrowing focus to essential goods. Long distance and luxury trade diminished, while regional exchange became more important. These shifts altered economic relationships between regions. Areas once central to trade lost prominence. Others gained importance, temporarily due to relative stability. These changes were not planned. They emerged from necessity and perception. The plague also altered military balance across empires. Armies depended on recruitment, training, and supply. Disease reduced all three. Campaigns were delayed or abandoned. Border defenses weakened. Opportunistic raids occurred in some regions, though large-scale invasions were less common than might be expected. Widespread illness discouraged sustained military action. Diplomatic relations adjusted accordingly. Treaties were renewed or ignored based on capacity, rather than intent. Communication slowed, trust eroded, yet outright collapse of international order did not occur. Like the cities themselves, empires adapted rather than disintegrated. One of the most enduring consequences of the plague spread was demographic. Population loss was uneven but significant across the Mediterranean world. Fewer people meant fewer workers, fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, and fewer consumers. Economic contraction followed naturally. This contraction was not immediate or uniform. It unfolded over decades. Some regions recovered faster, others stagnated. The cumulative effect was a world with lower population density, reduced urbanization, and altered patterns of settlement. Cultural exchange also slowed. Scholars traveled less. Artistic production declined. Monumental construction projects were postponed or abandoned. The emphasis shifted toward maintenance rather than innovation. This change did not end culture, but it narrowed its scope. Religious life adapted in response to shared suffering. Interpretations of divine purpose evolved across traditions. Emphasis on humility, endurance, and preparation for death became more pronounced. These themes resonated across cultural boundaries, creating a shared moral language shaped by crisis. It is important to note that contemporaries did not perceive this transformation as a single unified event. They experienced it locally, personally, and unevenly. Only later generations would see the broader pattern. For those living through it, the world simply felt more fragile, less predictable, and more constrained. The plague spread across empires also revealed the limits of imperial ambition. Justinian's vision of restoration depended on demographic and economic strength. As the population declined and resources thinned, that vision became harder to sustain. The same was true for rival powers. Ambition narrowed everywhere. Despite this, the interconnected world did not disappear. Trade continued, though reduced. Diplomacy persisted, though cautious. Travel did not cease, though it slowed. The plague reshaped connectivity rather than ending it. By spreading across empires, the disease transformed from a regional disaster into a global one by the standards of the time. It linked distant communities through shared experience of loss and uncertainty. This shared experience, though unrecognized as such, marked a turning point in world history. The Justinian plague did not end civilizations. It altered trajectories. It redirected energy from expansion to survival, from ambition to maintenance, from confidence to caution. These changes unfolded gradually, woven into daily life rather than announced through catastrophe. As the disease continued to return in later waves, these altered patterns hardened into new norms. Lower population became expected. Scarcity became familiar. Risk became constant. The world adjusted. This adjustment shaped the centuries that followed. Political fragmentation, economic localization, and cultural transformation all drew strength from the demographic shock of the plague. The Byzantine, the 6th century world did not collapse, but it contracted. By the time the plague had reached every major corner of the Mediterranean, connected world, its role as a defining historical force was undeniable. Yet it remained largely invisible as a single narrative. It was lived, not named. In this way, The plague spread across empires, completed its transformation from an outbreak into an era. It was no longer a crisis that might end, but a condition that reshaped how societies understood stability, power, and time, war, armies, and weakened borders. As the plague continued to move across regions and return in recurring waves, its impact on war and military power became steadily more apparent. Armies, like cities and farms, depended on people coordination and predictability. The Justinian plague undermined all three. Yet this process was gradual rather than dramatic. Borders did not collapse overnight. Armies did not vanish in a single season. Instead, military strength thinned quietly, campaign by campaign, year by year, until the balance of power across entire regions shifted. Before the plague, the Eastern Roman military was one of the most organized forces of its time. It combined professional soldiers, regional levies, and allied troops under a centralized command structure. Recruitment drew from a broad population base, training was continuous, supply chains were extensive and carefully managed. Justinian's campaigns in North Africa and Italy depended on this system's ability to sustain long operations far from the capital. Disease struck this system at its most vulnerable point: manpower. Soldiers lived in close quarters, shared equipment, and moved constantly between regions. These conditions made armies highly susceptible to contagion. When plague reached military camps, it spread quickly, disrupting units that had taken years to assemble and train. Losses were uneven. Some units were devastated, others were spared temporarily. This irregularity complicated planning. Commanders could not rely on consistent strength. Reinforcements arrived late, or not at all. Replacement troops lacked experience. Training schedules were interrupted by illness and death. Even when soldiers survived, fear altered behavior. Desertion increased subtly, not through mass flight, but through individual decisions. Some soldiers failed to return after leave. Others sought reassignment away from active fronts. These losses were difficult to track and harder to replace. Logistics suffered alongside manpower. Armies required food, animals, weapons, and pay. Each element depended on functioning civilian systems already weakened by plague. Supply delays became common. Equipment wore out without replacement. Horses died or were sold to feed populations in crisis. Justinian's administration prioritized maintaining military presence where possible. Key fronts received resources first. Secondary operations were postponed or abandoned. This prioritization reflected necessity rather than strategy. The empire could no longer afford to fight everywhere at once. In Italy, the impact was especially severe. The prolonged conflict had already damaged infrastructure and depopulated regions. The arrival of plague compounded these effects. Garrisons thinned, cities changed hands with less resistance. Control became nominal in some areas, dependent more on local arrangements than imperial force. Along the eastern frontier, relations with Persia grew tense but restrained. Both empires faced similar demographic pressures. Large-scale campaigns became risky. Border skirmishes occurred, but sustained offensives were rare. The plague imposed an unspoken limit on ambition. In the Balkans, defenses weakened as troops were redeployed or lost. Raids by neighboring groups increased in frequency, exploiting gaps in surveillance and response. These incursions were often small but persistent, eroding security over time. Naval power was also affected. Fleets required skilled crews, regular maintenance, and reliable ports. Illness reduced available sailors. Shipyards slowed production. Patrols decreased. Control of sea routes weakened, affecting both military and commercial movement. The psychological impact on military leadership was significant. Commanders accustomed to clear objectives now faced uncertainty. Planning became cautious. Risk tolerance declined. Success was measured in holding ground rather than gaining it. Training suffered in this environment. New recruits received less preparation. Veterans were lost faster than experience could be transmitted. Over time, this eroded institutional knowledge, making armies less adaptable. The relationship between soldiers and civilians also shifted. Armies depended more heavily on local resources, increasing strain on communities already struggling. Resentment grew quietly, though open rebellion remained rare due to shared hardship. Despite these challenges, the military did not disintegrate. Discipline persisted. Command structures remained intact. The empire continued to field armies, defend borders, and project power where possible. This endurance reflected institutional resilience and the absence of viable alternatives. However, the cumulative effect of repeated plague waves was unmistakable. Each return of disease removed more experienced soldiers, more officers, more administrators. Recovery periods shortened. There was no full restoration between outbreaks. Over time, the empire's strategic posture shifted from expansion to defense. Justinian's early ambition gave way to consolidation. Borders were held rather than extended. Fortifications were repaired rather than new ones built. This shift was not announced. It emerged through practice. Other powers experienced similar transitions across Europe and the Near East. Armies shrank, campaigns shortened, and ambitions narrowed. The plague imposed a shared restraint on warfare, not through diplomacy, but through biology. This restraint did not bring peace. Conflict continued, but at a different scale. Raids replaced campaigns. Sieges became rarer. Control fragmented. Power became more localized as central authorities struggled to sustain reach. The long-term consequences were profound. Military weakness encouraged political fragmentation. Regions became more autonomous. Local leaders gained influence. Central control loosened, not through collapse, but through necessity. By the end of the plague's most severe phases, the map of power looked subtly different, not radically altered, but softened at the edges. Borders remained, but they were borous. Authority persisted, but it was thinner. The Justinian plague did not defeat armies in battle. It defeated them through attrition. It drained strength without spectacle. It turned victory into maintenance and ambition into endurance. This transformation would shape the centuries that followed. The world emerged from the plague with fewer people, fewer soldiers, and fewer certainties. Warfare became one more activity, constrained by loss rather than driven by confidence. As the empire adjusted to these realities, attention turned inward. Survival, administration, and recovery took precedence over conquest. The plague had reshaped the meaning of power itself. Recurring waves and long fear, even after the most devastating months of the plague had passed, the people of the Eastern Roman world did not experience relief in the way they might have hoped. There was no clear ending, no moment when the disease vanished and life returned to familiar rhythms. Instead, what followed was something more exhausting and more unsettling. The plague returned again and again in waves that were unpredictable in uneven in severity, and deeply corrosive to confidence. The first decline in deaths brought cautious hope. Streets grew slightly busier, markets regained some sound and motion, burial carts appeared less frequently. Survivors began to believe that the worst might be over. This belief was understandable. Human beings seek patterns, and after months of relentless loss, even a small improvement felt significant. Yet, this improvement did not last. In some districts, new cases began to appear within months. In others, the return came after a year or more. Sometimes, the wave was severe. Sometimes it was limited. There was no reliable rhythm. The disease did not follow seasons consistently, nor did it respect boundaries that people had come to associate with safety. This unpredictability created a new form of fear, different from the terror of the first outbreak. The initial wave had shocked the population. Later waves exhausted it. People no longer asked whether the plague would return, but when. This long fear reshaped behavior across every level of society. Plans were made cautiously, if at all. Investments were delayed. Construction projects were postponed repeatedly. Families hesitated to marry or relocate, uncertain whether stability would last long enough to justify the effort. In cities, neighborhoods that had begun to recover were struck again. Shops reopened, only to close once more as illness returned. Craftsmen who had rebuilt workshops lost apprentices. Clergy who had survived earlier waves were lost later. Each recurrence erased progress. In rural areas, the effects were just as severe, though less visible. Fields that had been replanted after earlier losses were abandoned again. Livestock herds rebuilt, slowly were reduced once more. Communities that had stabilized were pushed back into scarcity. The countryside never experienced a single period of full recovery. It existed in a state of partial restoration, repeatedly undone. The psychological toll of this pattern was immense. The human mind can endure extreme hardship when it believes that hardship will end. Recurrent plague removed that belief. Fear became chronic rather than acute. It was no longer tied to immediate danger, but woven into expectation. People learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition. They adjusted emotionally, lowering expectations and narrowing hopes. This adjustment allowed survival, but it also altered ambition and trust. Religious interpretation adapted to this reality. Early explanations framed the plague as punishment or testing. Over time, emphasis shifted toward endurance and humility. The idea that suffering might persist without clear resolution became more widely accepted. Faith became less about deliverance and more about persistence. Medical practice also adjusted. Physicians no longer expected cures. Their role increasingly focused on comfort, observation, and managing symptoms. This shift was pragmatic rather than theoretical. Experience had taught them what was possible and what was not. The recurring waves also revealed generational differences. Older people who had survived multiple outbreaks carried a quiet wariness. Younger people who grew up amid plague had no memory of a disease-free world. For them, instability was normal. This generational shift subtly altered attitudes toward risk, work, and authority. Children raised during this period learned caution early. They were taught to avoid certain spaces, to recognize illness quickly, to accept loss without ceremony. Their understanding of life was shaped by absence as much as presence. Population recovery stalled as repeated waves removed gains. Birth rates struggled to compensate for ongoing mortality. Entire family lines ended quietly. Inheritance patterns hanged as property passed unexpectedly or reverted to the state. Urban density decreased gradually. Empty houses accumulated. Some neighborhoods shrank permanently. Others consolidated as survivors moved closer together for mutual support. The shape of cities changed slowly. Without formal planning, labor scarcity became persistent rather than temporary. Workers who survived gained leverage, but this advantage was unstable. Each new wave threatened to remove them as well. Employers hesitated to invest in training. Apprenticeships declined. Economic contraction became normalized. Markets adjusted to lower volume. Long-distance trade narrowed further. Luxury goods became rarer. Practical necessities dominated exchange. Wealth still existed, but it circulated more cautiously. Political leadership faced a difficult balance. Emergency measures could not remain permanent. Yet, normal governance could not fully resume. Administrations learned to operate in a state of reduced capacity indefinitely. Crisis management became routine. This normalization of crisis was perhaps the plague's most profound legacy. When disaster becomes expected, it loses its ability to shock, but not its power to shape behavior. People adapted, but adaptation carried cost. The repeated return of disease also undermined confidence in progress. Efforts to rebuild felt provisional. No achievement seemed secure. This mindset discouraged innovation and favored preservation. Military recovery was similarly constrained. Units rebuilt after one outbreak were weakened by the next. Training cycles were interrupted repeatedly. Experience was lost faster than it could be replaced. Armies functioned, but rarely at full strength. Borders held, but tenuously. Defense replaced expansion as a permanent posture, rather than a temporary adjustment. This shift reshaped political priorities across empires. Communication. Ion networks thinned further. Travel remained possible, but cautious. Information moved slowly and unreliably. Rumor often replaced record. The plague's recurrence also affected memory. Over time, individual outbreaks blurred together. People remembered years of illness rather than specific events. This blending made it difficult to mark beginnings or endings. The plague became an era rather than an episode. Yet life continued. Children were born, crops were planted, laws were enforced imperfectly. Communities gathered when they could. Survival itself became an achievement. The long fear did not produce constant panic. Instead, it produced restraint. People lived carefully, conserving energy and expectation. Joy did not disappear, but it became quieter. When later generations looked back, they would struggle to understand how people endured so long without resolution. The answer lay not in heroism or despair, but in adjustment. Human beings adapt even to prolonged uncertainty. The Justinian plague did not end after a single generation. It returned repeatedly for decades. Each return reinforced the lesson that stability could not be assumed. The world had changed permanently, not through collapse, but through erosion. By the time the waves finally weakened, the Mediterranean world had been reshaped demographically, economically, and psychologically. The plague had taught societies to live smaller, slower, and more cautiously. This long period of fear did not destroy civilization, but it redirected it. Ambition narrowed, confidence softened, endurance replaced certainty as the core virtue. Economic and social change, as the recurring waves of plague stretched across decades, the Eastern Roman world did not simply wait for recovery, it adapted. These adaptations were not coordinated reforms or deliberate transformations. They emerged slowly, unevenly from countless individual decisions made under pressure. Together, they reshaped economic life and social relationships in ways that would outlast the disease itself. Before the plague, economic activity across the empire rested on abundance of labor and predictability of demand. Cities thrived on dense populations. Crafts depended on steady apprenticeships. Landowners assumed a continuous supply of workers. Prices were shaped by long-standing patterns. The plague disrupted every one of these assumptions. The most immediate economic effect was labor scarcity. Death removed workers faster than they could be replaced. This scarcity did not resolve after a single wave. Each recurrence reinforced it. As a result, the balance between labor and land shifted fundamentally. Survivors found themselves in a position they had not occupied before. In agriculture, this shift was particularly pronounced. Fields still existed, tools remained, but hands were missing. Landowners who once dictated terms now faced empty plots. To keep land productive, they offered incentives. Rent was reduced, obligations were renegotiated. In some regions, formally bound workers gained greater freedom of movement. These changes were not driven by ideology, but by necessity. Urban labor followed a similar pattern. Craftsmen who survived became more valuable. Wages rose in some trades, though payment was often irregular. Skilled workers could choose among employers or negotiate better conditions. This flexibility altered relationships within workshops and guilds, weakening hierarchical structures that are dependent on surplus labor. Apprenticeships declined. Training required time and investment, both of which felt risky in an uncertain environment. Masters hesitated to take on apprentices who might not survive long enough to become productive. This hesitation slowed transmission of skills and reduced long-term capacity. Markets adjusted accordingly. With fewer producers and consumers, volume declined. Prices fluctuated unpredictably. In others, lack of demand caused them to fall. These inconsistencies undermined confidence in trade, encouraging caution. Long-distance commerce narrowed further. Merchants focused on essential goods rather than luxury items. Risk assessment changed. Routes perceived as dangerous were avoided. Credit tightened. Investment slowed. The economy contracted, not through collapse, but through restraint. Urban centers experienced gradual depopulation. Empty houses accumulated. Entire neighborhoods shrank. Some buildings were repurposed. Others fell into disrepair. This physical change reflected deeper social transformation. Cities no longer assumed growth, they adjusted to maintenance. Social hierarchy softened in practice, though not in law. Titles remained. Legal distinctions persisted, yet daily life blurred boundaries. Wealth could not prevent illness. Rank could not guarantee security. Shared vulnerability altered interactions subtly. Charity took on increased importance. Religious institutions expanded their role in providing food, care, and burial. These efforts filled gaps left by weakened state and family structures. Charity became less exceptional and more routine. Family structures adapted as well. Extended families consolidated households to pull labor and resources. Orphans were absorbed by relatives or religious communities. Marriage patterns shifted. Some unions were delayed, others were hastened. These decisions reflected survival strategies rather than tradition. Inheritance patterns changed unpredictably. Sudden deaths disrupted succession. Property passed unexpectedly. In some cases, estates fragmented. In others, they consolidated under surviving relatives or institutions. These changes altered aft distribution over time. Gender roles adjusted in response to necessity. Women took on increased economic responsibility, managing property, overseeing labor, and engaging in trade where possible. These roles did not overturn legal norms, but they expanded practical authority. Urban governance reflected similar adaptation. Local leaders relied more on informal arrangements. Community consensus mattered more than strict enforcement. This flexibility preserved order but reduced uniformity. The social fabric absorbed loss by redefining normality. Reduced population became expected. Scarcity became familiar. This adjustment allowed continuity, but it also limited ambition. Education suffered. Schools closed or functioned irregularly. Literacy rates likely declined. Intellectual life narrowed, focusing on preservation rather than expansion of knowledge. Despite contraction, innovation did not disappear entirely. Some agricultural techniques improved to compensate for labor shortage. Tool use became more efficient in certain regions. These changes were localized and gradual. The plague thus reshaped the economy not by destroying it, but by rebalancing it. Power shifted slightly towards survivors. Expectations lowered, flexibility increased. This transformation was not universally beneficial. Many suffered permanent loss. Recovery was uneven. Yet the system endured by becoming smaller and more cautious. Social relationships reflected this caution. Trust became conditional. Cooperation became pragmatic. Community persisted, but with sharper awareness of risk. Over time, these changes hardened into new norms. The world that emerged after decades of plague was not the same one that had existed before. It was less populous, less ambitious, and more restrained. Yet, it remained recognizable. Markets still operated, families still formed, authority still existed. Civilization continued altered, but intact. The economic and social changes wrought by the plague were not revolutionary. They were accumulative, each adjustment built on the last until the overall shape of society had shifted. This shift prepared the ground for the next phase of history. A world shaped by endurance rather than expansion would face new challenges differently. The legacy of the plague would persist long after its last wave faded, a transformed Mediterranean world. By the time the most destructive waves of the Justinian plague had passed, the Mediterranean world was no longer what it had been at the beginning of Justinian's reign. No single law, battle, or political decision marked this transformation. Instead, change emerged from years of accumulated loss, adaptation, and restraint. The world had not collapsed, but it had been reshaped in ways that were subtle, uneven, and enduring. One of the most significant transformations was demographic. Population loss was widespread, though unevenly distributed. Cities that had once been crowded became thinner. Some neighborhoods never fully recovered. Rural areas experienced long-term depopulation, especially in marginal lands. This reduction in population altered every aspect of life, from economic capacity to military strength, from cultural production to political ambition. Urban life changed in scale and character. Cities remained centers of administration and trade, but their density decreased. Public spaces felt larger, quieter. Buildings that had once housed multiple families stood partially empty. Maintenance replaced expansion as the primary urban concern. Instead of constructing new monuments, authorities focused on keeping essential infrastructure functional. Trade networks adapted accordingly. The Mediterranean remained interconnected, but connections were fewer and more cautious. Long distance trade declined. In volume and scope. Regional exchange gained importance. Essential goods moved more reliably than luxury items. The world grew more localized, not through isolation, but through selective engagement. Political power reflected this localization. Central authority persisted, particularly in the Eastern Roman Empire, but its reach was thinner. Provincial governors exercised greater autonomy out of necessity. Local arrangements mattered more than imperial directives in daily life. This shift did not eliminate empire, but it altered how empire functioned. Justinian's vision of restoration survived in name, but not in scale. His legal reforms endured, shaping future legal systems. His building projects remained symbols of imperial ambition. Yet the demographic and economic realities imposed limits. Expansion gave way to consolidation. Preservation replaced growth. Military posture reflected this transformation. Armies continued to exist, but their size and capacity were reduced. Defense became the primary objective. Fortifications were maintained rather than extended. Borders remained, but they were more permeable. Power became less absolute and more negotiated. Cultural life adapted as well. Artistic production slowed, patronage declined. Large-scale projects became rare. Yet, preservation of knowledge gained importance. Texts were copied, traditions were maintained. Culture narrowed, but it did not disappear. Religious life played a central role in this transformed world. Shared suffering reinforced spiritual frameworks that emphasized endurance and humility. Religious institutions became anchors of continuity, providing care, charity, and moral structure. Faith adapted to long-term uncertainty rather than short-term crisis. Social relationships reflected new realities. Communities were smaller and more tightly bound. Trust was practical rather than idealistic. Ration emerged from necessity. Hierarchies softened in daily interaction. Even if legal distinctions remained, the environment itself bore marks of change. Abandoned fields returned to scrub. Forests expanded in some regions. Human pressure on the land eased slightly. This environmental shift was not planned, but it reshaped landscapes over generations. The Mediterranean world became quieter, slower, and more cautious. Time horizons shortened. Risk tolerance declined. People planned for survival rather than prosperity. This mindset influenced governance, economy, and culture alike. Yet continuity persisted alongside transformation. Roads were still used, ships still sailed, markets still opened, law still mattered. The world did not enter darkness. It adjusted. This adjustment was not uniform. Some regions recovered more quickly, others stagnated. Inequality between regions increased. The Mediterranean world became more fragmented in experience, even as it remained connected. Later generations would debate the significance of this transformation. Some would see the plague as a turning point, marking the end of an era. Others would emphasize continuity and resilience. Both views contain truth. The plague did not end classical civilization, but it altered its trajectory. The transformed Mediterranean world that emerged from the Justinian plague was shaped by endurance rather than ambition. It valued stability over expansion. It accepted limitation as normal. These values would influence centuries of history to come. This transformation did not erase memory of what had been lost. People remembered fuller cities, busier markets, and greater confidence. That memory shaped expectations, sometimes as longing, sometimes as caution. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, the plague had become part of historical memory rather than immediate experience. Its lessons were guided in institutions, habits, and assumptions. The world had adapted without fully understanding how deeply it had changed. The Mediterranean remained a world of interaction, culture, and power. But it was no longer the expansive, densely populated system it had once been. It was a world recalibrated by loss. Understanding this transformed world is essential to understanding what followed. The political, cultural, and economic developments of later centuries were shaped by the demographic shock and psychological adjustment brought by the plague. The Justinian plague did not dictate the future, but it constrained it. It narrowed possibilities and reshaped priorities. In doing so, it became one of the most consequential forces in shaping the medieval Mediterranean. What emerged was not collapse, but endurance, a world that survived by becoming smaller, more cautious, and more resilient in quiet ways. This world would carry forward the imprint of the plague long after its final wave had passed. When the Justinian plague finally loosened its grip, it did not depart in a way that allowed people to mark its passing with certainty. There was no final outbreak that could be clearly identified as the last. Instead, the disease faded unevenly, retreating from some regions while lingering in others, returning sporadically, then falling quiet again. For those who lived through it, the plague became less an event than a condition of life, and its end was not experienced as relief, so much as exhaustion slowly giving way to adaptation. Memory of the plague formed gradually. At first, recollection was personal and immediate. People remembered faces, names, and losses within families and neighborhoods. Entire households vanished. Crafts ended with the death of the last practitioner. Streets changed character when familiar figures were no longer present. These memories were vivid, but localized, tied to place and relationship rather than abstract understanding. As years passed, individual memories blended into shared narratives. Stories circulated about the worst months, about days when carts moved constantly through the streets, about moments when entire districts fell silent. These stories did not follow fixed forms. They varied depending on who told them and where. In rural areas, memory focused on abandoned fields and broken harvest cycles. In cities, it centered on death, scarcity, and administrative strain. Written records captured only fragments of this experience. Chroniclers described mortality in broad terms. They recorded numbers when they could, though such numbers were often symbolic rather than precise. They emphasized moral lessons, divine testing, or the fragility of human order. These accounts shaped how later generations would understand the plague, but they did not fully convey the texture of daily life during those years. What mattered more than accuracy was meaning. People needed to place the plague within a framework that made endurance possible. Religious interpretation played a central role in this process. The plague was remembered as a trial endured collectively, a reminder of human limitation and divine authority. These interpretations did not erase grief, but they provided coherence. Over time, the plague's memory influenced behavior, even when direct experience faded. Communities that had survived repeated waves learned caution. They remembered how quickly stability could unravel. This memory shaped planning, investment, and governance. Long-term confidence was tempered by awareness of vulnerability. One of the most significant impacts of the plague was demographic, and this impact shaped memory as much as meaning. Population loss was not recovered quickly. In many regions, numbers remained lower for generations. This hence became normal. Cities planned for smaller populations. Rural areas adjusted to reduced labor. Memory of former abundance lingered as contrast rather than expectation. This demographic shift influenced political power. States that relied on manpower for taxation, military recruitment, and administration faced lasting constraints. Ambitions narrowed, expansion became risky, preservation became central. The plague did not directly dictate policy, but it limited what policy could achieve. Legal and administrative systems absorbed these lessons quietly. Justinian's legal reforms endured, but their application occurred in a world with fewer officials and less capacity. Governance adapted to scarcity. Flexibility increased, enforcement softened. These changes became habitual rather than exceptional. Cultural production reflected similar restraint. Monumental building declined, patron narrowed, artistic and intellectual life persisted, but it focused more on preservation than innovation. Texts were copied to prevent loss. Traditions were maintained rather than expanded. The plague's impact on social hierarchy was subtle but enduring. Legal distinctions remained, but lived experience blurred boundaries. Shared vulnerability reshaped interactions. Authority continued, but it carried less assumption of control. Leadership was judged increasingly by maintenance rather than achievement. The Mediterranean world that emerged from the plague was not defined by collapse, but by recalibration. Networks still existed, trade continued, empires persisted. Yet scale mattered, everything functioned at reduced intensity. This reduction was not necessarily perceived as decline by those who lived through it. It was simply reality. Later, historical interpretation would struggle with this nuance. Some would view the plague as the end of the ancient world. Others would emphasize continuity. Yea, in truth, it was neither abrupt ending nor seamless continuation. It was a long adjustment that altered direction without breaking structure. The Justinian plague also shaped how later societies understood disease. While medical knowledge did not advance dramatically at the time, Memory of widespread mortality at the time, memory of widespread mortality influenced responses to later outbreaks. Fear, caution, and resignation were informed by experience, even when causes remained mysterious. Perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. The plague reshaped expectations about permanence. Cities, laws, and empires were no longer assumed to be self-sustaining. Survival required effort, coordination, and humility. This mindset would influence medieval governance and culture long after the disease itself faded. Memory of the plague was not always explicit. It lived in habits, in reduced ambition, in cautious planning. It lived in the way communities responded to later crises. It lived in the acceptance of uncertainty as a permanent condition. For historians, the Justinian plague represents one of the earliest clearly documented pandemics to affect a connected world. Its significance lies not only in mortality numbers, but in how it revealed the vulnerability of complex systems. Trade, governance, and culture were intertwined, and disease exploited that interdependence without intention. The plague did not act as a conscious force. It had no purpose. Its impact emerged from biology intersecting with human structure. This intersection reshaped history, quietly without dramatic declarations. When viewed from a distance, the plague's legacy is visible in what followed. The Mediterranean world entered a period of slower growth, increased localization, and altered political balance. These developments were influenced by many factors, but demographic shock played a central role. Yet, it is important to emphasize resilience. People endured, institutions adapted, culture persisted. The world did not vanish into silence. It continued, changed, but recognizable. The memory of the Justinian plague, thus, carries a dual meaning. It reminds us of fragility, but also of endurance. It shows how societies can survive profound loss without collapsing by adjusting expectations and priorities. For those who lived through it, meaning was not found in historical significance, but in daily survival. For later generations, meaning emerged gradually as patterns became visible over time. In the end, the Justinian plague was neither simply a disaster nor simply a turning point. It was a long-shaping presence that oriented the Mediterranean world toward caution, maintenance, and resilience. Its story does not end with numbers or dates. It ends with a transformed world that carried its lessons forward, often unconsciously, into the centuries that followed.